Yo, what's a good shinobi nation? Welcome back to Just a Shinobi, the home of the craziest Naruto What Ifs. Today we're jumping into part 4 of What If Naruto was trapped in a time loop. So strap in, because things are about to get explosive. If you're new to the channel, make sure to smash that subscribe button, hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video with your whole ninja squad. And of course, drop your theories in the comments. Your support is what keeps this shinobi grinding. At their first morning date, which was now a picnic under the clouds amidst the trees, with several curious kunoichi spying from nearby bushes, Naruto turned to the lavender-haired girl beside him and clasped her hands within his own, gazing fondly into her eyes to ask, "Hinata-chan, can I share with you a secret, a very special secret?" Her breath caught and quickened, a blush seizing her features, but she nodded, desperately happy. Seeing what she thought he was about to confess, he smiled. "Yes, Hinata-chan, I do love you. But there will be time to talk of that later. Can I tell you something else? Something that may be hard to believe?" A wide, shy, disbelieving yet happy face had seized upon her features, but she rallied herself, determined to be there for him, and nodded once again. Naruto sighed. He tried this a few times recently with the Hokage trying to convince the man of what was truly happening to him. But it had failed. Heck, he tried on his very first day to convince him. Often since that time he thought over how he might do it better. Now was a good chance to try. He went from holding Hinata's hands in his to holding her close to him. The kunoichi concealed among the trees all cooed at the scene, but it allowed him to whisper into her hair so no one overheard. "You know that sealing scrolls and summon techniques all do stuff with space-time?" She nodded barely perceptibly. If he hadn't been holding her he would have missed it, but he could almost feel her curiosity over where he was going with this. So he did his best to satisfy that. "Something happened to me, an accident, I don't really know. But one of those space-time jutsus went way wrong with me, not just a little wrong but big time. You see," he took a deep breath to steady himself before this admission. The last times he tried to explain this to her, back before he memorized the answers to the test, she'd never been able to believe him. And it hurt. Oh, how it had hurt. Shudderingly slightly, he made his admission. "Hinata-chan, every day I wake up it is the same as it was yesterday, and the same it will be tomorrow. I always wake up on the morning of the first test of the Chunin exam, and the whole day plays itself over exactly as it did before, unless I change it. I'm caught in a time loop, where all of my tomorrows are the same as my yesterdays, and each and every morning is the start of the Chunin exam." She trembled within his arms, not knowing what to say. She felt him. He was close to her, and she could feel he was hurting over this, so she believed he was serious. It all just came at her so unexpectedly. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to comfort him. But then she knew. She simply hugged him back, laid her head on his shoulder, and whispered back, "I believe you." He nearly broke down crying on the spot. A soft sigh of romantic fondness echoed from a dozen or so kunoichi's throats over this tender moment. Most expected him to pull out a ring and put it on her finger, and were disappointed when that didn't happen. Aye. So she paused nervously, playing her fingers together, after they had found some privacy, and he'd begun his explanations. We helped you with your medical studies?" Her face was a dark, dark red, and she'd already fainted a couple of times, but he'd always revived her. Naruto nodded, putting an arm behind his head to rub the back of his neck. "Yeah. When I first asked you, you fainted, and woke up disappointed you were still wearing clothes." She blushed bright scarlet, but he did the gentle thing of pretending not to notice. "Enko stripped down, and posed just to see me blush. Tenten undressed like it was an everyday event, but I caught a few hints that it was anything but, and she was thinking of very naughty stuff. And when I asked Temari she did a sexy strip and tried to jump me. Since her brother has scared every guy in town away, she was saying she'd probably die a virgin if she doesn't take any opportunity she can get." "Every opportunity?" Hinata stuttered, scarlet. "So far I was her first opportunity, that is, or so she said, not that anything actually happened," Naruto chuckled. "I was too busy wanting to get through my study material and get the medical skill I wanted." Did you see Ayama Ichiroku's ramen stand nude too?" the shy Hyuga heiress stuttered out. Naruto blinked several times in surprise. "You know, I'd forgotten all about that place." All of the blood flushed from Hinata's face. Either you aren't Naruto, or you have been trapped in that loop for a long time. How could you have forgotten her? She's been very nice to you. The boy shrugged helplessly. Sorry, Hinata, I just did. I used to eat ramen all the time, every day. But with everything else the same, I had to get some variety, so after Ino started to teach me how to cook, well, I haven't had a ramen since. Suddenly stern and finding her backbone, Hinata grabbed Naruto's hand and marched him off to go eat ramen with her at Ichiruka's stand. There she piped up to the serving waitress, "Excuse me, Ichiruka-san, but Naruto is studying to be a medic ninja. We were wondering if, after our ramen, you could help him learn to give an exam?" Ayam stopped in her tracks, staring at the determined girl. "You've already helped him?" Turning solid scarlet, Hinata nodded, sucking in her bottom lip and very nearly passing out. Wow! Ayam stood there blinking in surprise. Then she tilted her head in suspicion of the young blonde boy. "Are you sure you're studying to be a medic ninja?" Naruto shrugged. "And nurse and midwife, too. Full medic ninja is something that will have to wait until I have better chakra control. But well, here." He held out a hand, fluctuating with blue energy as he didn't presently have his limiters on, and explained, "This is the standard chakra scalpel technique, used for performing surgery without breaking the skin. Every medic ninja has to know this one. Only, as you can see, mine is alternating between surges and dips, with no way of telling which is which. I could hit someone with it in combat, and not hurt him, or try to remove a wart and blow someone's head clean off. So it's not very useful, not until I have a lot more experience." Ayam and Hinata were both staring at his technique. Both were impressed, although Hinata felt more vindicated, while Ayam was more surprised. "Wow!" the daughter of the ramen stand owner said. "You really are learning how to be a medic." She sounded joyful, and turned to beam a smile on him. "Sure! I'll be glad to help you. Wait just 1 minute, you finish up your ramen and I'll nip out back. Follow me when you're done, okay?" Aye. Naruto walked out of the back of the ramen stand, face aflush and flaming. "You know," he told Hinata, "it's different when someone else is there trying to help you by pointing out all of the other girls' bits." "I know," Hinata played with her fingertips. "But I just wanted to make sure you knew what was there," and actually, what she'd wanted was to confirm his statement about knowing those sorts of things. So she'd pushed the envelope a bit, and even she had to admit she had probably gone too far. But then, having 360-degree X-ray vision did not lead to a great deal of ignorance about basic physiology, and she'd wanted to know how much he knew. "And it got so different from usual when you took off your own clothes and the two of you started to use the other as anatomy models for me. I just don't know how I should take that, is all." Naruto was shaking his head. Hinata had always seemed so much more shy than that. "Well, it only seemed fair," the lavender-haired heiress mumbled softly, pushing her fingers together some more. A moment later she ventured, Did you get all of the measurements that you wanted?" "Yeah," Naruto nodded his head, still in somewhat of a daze. "I did. Though why you insisted on you both receiving the full spa treatment, while I got her measured for new clothes." The girl looked shyly down to her fingers, blushing rose. In truth, she'd wanted to know what that was like, and it had seemed unfair to deny it to Ayam-san too, especially since they were there for her exam in the first place. And it was her house, so it seemed only polite. And somehow the Hyuga girl felt so vindicated that she'd been right about the value and worth of her Naruto-kun all along when that nice ramen girl started to cry out marriage proposals to him at the top of her lungs. She probably shouldn't have enjoyed it so much, but she had. Hinata felt all aglow with righteous vindication in that she'd been right to love Naruto all along. She'd even been there to witness another girl approve of him. And there was something else to consider too, in that having been naked before him, and having put his hands all over her, had greatly reduced the Hyuga girl's shyness towards him. Although the present circumstances were so awkward it was hard to tell. In truth, all she wanted right then was another pelvic exam, or another set of breast palpitations, or both. Both. And a massage. Yes, another massage, one with the body oil again. Although she felt too awkward to ask. "You do promise to fine-tune all of her clothes later?" she asked. "Yeah, I'll spend the next reset or two on it," Naruto agreed. "And did you enjoy the ramen?" She turned the subject away from those presently causing her flaming blush. The village pariah grinned. Yeah, I did. It brought back some memories of old times. Ones that were actually good. Aye. Hey, Tenten. Naruto called out to the girl right before they could see her out where she was practicing. But before she turned around, they were in view. I know what your secret desire is, and I'm going to give it to you. The girl gave a negative smirk, turning back to her throwing. You know, that's a lousy pick-up line. And what's worse is you shouldn't be trying to pick up more girls when you've already got one. She noticed him and Hinata holding hands. Oh, but it wasn't a pick-up line, he told her with a glad grin. I'm only trying to prove to Hinata that I have more knowledge than she could give me credit for, in order to prove a more wild theory to her. The weapons mistress turned back to face them, blinking. Okay, so what is my secret desire? Aye. This is lead, request radio check and status. This is Unit 1, check. I'm in position. Unit 3 in position. Target in sight, check. Unit 2, I guess. Give me another minute. Target in motion. Unit 3 called out suddenly. Bearing and speed? Lead demanded sternly. Lost visual, it's looking dang. A fox has gotten it. The Jonin gave a heavy sigh as his Genin team lost it. All units, report back to base. And Chi-Chi, you're the one who has to tell the Fire Lord's wife that you let her cat get eaten. Ah. The Genin girl whined miserably. That is so unfair. Elsewhere, Naruto, in fox form, trotted boldly out of the woods and placed the dead pet of the Fire Lord's wife before Tenten's waiting hands, where she'd been kneeling beside Hinata, waiting for him. The girl giggled, a smile on her cheeks. Okay, she laughed. You're right. I'd never admitted that to anyone, but after our first mission to retrieve that blasted cat, when she tore up one of my favorite dresses, I've always nurtured a secret desire to see her dead. You got me. That was it, my secret desire, and you filled it. As a few of Naruto's clones, also in fox form, dragged the cat off into the bushes to consume it, waste not, want not, and the ability to become a cat could prove useful, so learning its internal anatomy was a must. Besides, to a fox taste buds, cat was delicious. The girl picked up Naruto Fox and began to cuddle him. As she petted him, she asked, so what is this big secret you're trying to prove to Hinata? Aye. Hi honey, I'm home. Naruto called out as he threw open the door wide and entered the Inuzuka family clinic. Hana got the surprise of her life as her brushing of her dog got interrupted by the blonde-haired boy coming inside, picking her up using her clan's beast mimicry technique to grant his muscles the strength to do it, dropped a kiss right on her, and just the way she liked it, rubbed shoulders with her in the clan way, then went further and placed his blunt teeth softly on her neck in the manner of an alpha, displaying dominance over her. Then he gave her the sniff of a mate. If she wasn't so stunned, she could hardly think she would have killed him for that. Her hand came up anyway, grabbing him around the throat and lifting him off of the floor. She noticed, out of the corner of her eye, a pair of girls, probably Genin by the looks of them, hanging out in the door watching this. Okay, brat. You've got about 5 seconds to explain what you're up to before I break your neck. Aye. Naruto! Hana shouted out, awash in pleasure, before surging up off of the couch and grabbing him by his lapels. Marry me! Of course, I'd love to, he agreed demurely, setting aside the massage oil to take her in a hug, giving a wink to the clones in the background who went on playing soft music in the string quartet they had formed. The clones in the kitchen went on smugly cooking food while those presently designing her outfits amid the scented candles paused to give each other quiet nods. The other 2 girls, receiving similar treatments to the Inuzuka clan heiress, also lazily murmured out their own marriage proposals. But I've got a secret to share that you may find hard to believe. He shook his head sadly, still giving her a hug. In fact, no one else has believed without some form of strong proof of my knowing things I shouldn't. Aye. Hi, Gramps. Naruto wandered into the Hokage's office, Hinata in tow, as she had wanted to see this part. The trio from Sand, Kankuro, Gaara and Temari followed in moments after, with a wide-eyed Tenten and Hana following later. Ah, Naruto. The old man took his pipe out and smiled. To what do I owe the pleasure of this visit? Arashi's child pointed a thumb to Gaara, who was coming up disturbingly close to the blonde-haired genin, and seemed possessive, as if he was a child who had just discovered teddy bears. This is Gaara, the demon container of the one-tailed raccoon. He and his team are the lead elements of an invasion plan to destroy Konoha so the lord of their country would stop sending ninja assignments our way instead of theirs. Sarutobi's recently replaced pipe fell out of his mouth as he dropped it open in shock. Remember, you promised to play skip rope with me after we confessed the Kazekage's plans to break our treaty and destroy your village, the red-haired psychopath whispered in low and deadly tones. Do not forget. Looking forward to it. Naruto shot the other container a nice guy pose with a thumbs up and toothy grin, even getting the glint to appear just right. That time studying under Lee and Guy was just too cool for words. Just as outgoing as he was, just as bold and unashamed of themselves and the way they did things, they were like the family he'd never had, or something. But Gaara hadn't gotten to play any of those normal kid games any more than Naruto had, so it was a simple matter to invite him to a few, and after playing jacks and hopscotch and a few ball games, earning his friendship for life, convince him to confess the invasion plans to the Hokage in return for a few more. Heck, Naruto enjoyed those as much as Gaara did. Oh, and by the way, the blonde put his hands on his hips, directing a question to the old man, wasn't the fourth Hokage my father? Sarutobi fell out of his chair. Aye. Sarutobi's face grew grave. That is a very interesting problem, Naruto. Can you offer me any proof? Although the Hokage looked out the window, there were ninja running all over Konoha right now like a disturbed wasp nest, but he had elected to hear more of the boy's story. And what a story it was! Naruto rolled his eyes, kicking back in Hana's lap on the big love seat he had unsealed from out of a scroll, Hinata on his right and Tenten on his left, with Temari seated on the footrest, holding his feet in her lap and wondering what to do with herself. The boy was literally awash in girls. Heaving a sigh, Naruto told him, Gramps, I've been over this a time or two with you before now. Nothing I've said could convince you, and it's not like I can take a note back with me. Nothing physical changes. What would you accept as proof? Sarutobi rocked back into his seat, sucking intently on his pipe for a few moments, as he silently devoted himself to thought. That was an interesting question, Naruto. It's a pity you don't know any of the higher-level illusions. There are some that could be used to share a person's memories. Really? The boy shot up out of his very plush chair and was hanging off of the Hokage's every word. Who can teach them? Can you send me off to learn those? Huh. Please. The Hokage was a little surprised at the boy's reaction. So he asked, why so eager to give me proof, Naruto? With this information, we can foil the invasion either way. But the boy was vigorously shaking his head. No. You don't understand. If I had some way to share memories, I could be giving other people their own sets of experiences from previous resets. I could have friends. Friends who remembered me. I wouldn't be all alone anymore. Sarutobi sighed. He hated to disappoint the boy. He lay aside his pipe and said, I'm sorry, Naruto, but those illusions are only useful for sharing your own experiences. To share someone else's memories, you'd first have to acquire them yourself, and only the Yamanaka clan techniques. The Hokage realized he was talking to an empty office. Aye. You. Naruto threw open the door to the Yamanaka family flower shop and pointed a finger at Ino. I need your clan techniques. The girl smirked, smug in her reply, not pausing in arranging some flowers for sale. Sorry, but not going to happen. They are for our clan members only, Naruto. No exceptions. Although she felt quite flattered that he would ask. There had been times lately when she'd wondered what good they were, as she wasn't turning out to be a very strong ninja. The boy didn't even have to think about it for a second before approaching and pressing himself nose to nose with her. Marry me. You. Ino shoved him away. No way. Why would I want you when I could have someone like Sasuke? Aye. Ino groaned in pleasure as one Naruto massaged her back while another ran brushes with scented oils through her hair, as a third measured her foot for the shoes she was to be wearing, thoughts of seducing the young tailor going through her mind. Sasuke? Sasuke who? Who was he and what did he matter? The best catch in all of Konoha was making her outfits right now. Naruto, she murmured out, awash in pleasure. Will you marry me? The other 4 girls present, some of them undergoing this for the second or third time that day, groaned out their own agreements. Of course, I'd love to, he agreed demurely. But I wouldn't want to feel an outcast on the inside, he murmured. I've already had enough of that from the rest of Konoha. So really I couldn't agree unless I was going to be taught the clan techniques. Here you form this hand sealed, the girly puddle of pleasure demonstrated. Outside, some Naruto clones were playing jump rope with Gaara while Ninja ran all about Konoha in somewhat of a panic over the upcoming invasion by sand. Naruto had always wanted to wear the Hokage's hat. Now he had become it. It was a simple way of spying on the old man as the day of the Chunin finals arrived, as at some point the old guy was going to die, and he hoped to avoid that in future resets by replacing him so that it would be a clone of Naruto under a shape shift that Orochimaru ambushed instead of the actual Hokage. Of course, as hard to convince as the Hokage could be of this outlandish story, the only methods to pulling that off were either to take out the old guy himself, knocking him out to stick in a closet somewhere to wait until the bad parts had passed, which did not sound fun or easy, on a scale with taking down Orochimaru, actually, and worse in that it could involve hurt feelings after the fact, or failure and exile before it, or, better yet, show him enough evidence to convince him. And Naruto's ideal method for convincing Sarutobi both that the danger he was in and what Naruto was undergoing was real would be to show him the actual fight between himself, the Hokage, and Orochimaru. Of course, to show him such a thing first required Naruto to acquire it. Not the least of those barriers was that same one convinced the Hokage. Of course, he should have remembered to eat, as during the long wait for Sasuke to show up for his fight, Naruto's tummy rumbled. The young boy was in the act of wondering how it had done so when he was presently a hat atop the Hokage's head, and didn't currently have a stomach, when the shocked Hokage reacted with the instant response of a highly trained ninja and struck his cap, knocking the shape-shifted boy out. Naruto woke up in his apartment again and sighed, then brightened, jumping out of bed to split into thousands of clones, some select few of which sped out across town to visit certain young ladies in their beds. The month leading up to that reset had been pretty good, actually. He'd done his best to make it so. Ino had taught him what she knew, but she didn't know much compared to the total of her family's mind techniques. But that was okay. Naruto had taken what she taught him as a starting off point and invented the rest of what he needed. The Hokage had been very generous in allowing him access to Kurenai's time, even though the illusion specialist was very needed for the upcoming assault. All of the Jonin had been called on, until some were nearly worn ragged by the preparations they'd had to make. Luckily, Sarutobi knew that, and had proclaimed a mandatory few days near the end there for overworked, overstressed ninja to relax a bit to regain the fighting form they'd lost during the prep times. It hadn't changed the result any, but it had been a nice gesture, very thoughtful of the old man. Actually, Naruto had only gotten any of Kurenai's time at all by proclaiming that the Hokage needn't put him on any kind of priority list at all. Naruto had been kicking back in the old man's office, relaxed when no one else in Konoha was. Teachers were teaching their students at a feverish pace and all sorts of other measures were being taken to make sure that everything was ready. Entire new defensive structures, bunkers as well as shelters and emergency hospitals had to be redesigned from the ground up, as Ibiki and a squad of Jonin had taken Kabuto and his teammates captive, proven their treason, and under interrogation those traitors revealed that the present defensive arrangements of Konoha were entirely known to their enemies and compromised in full. Retreating your civilians and children into a shelter your enemy had already put traps in ahead of time was only asking for more casualties. While trying to do trauma medicine in a clinic lined with explosive tags just got messy. But clearing out those traps and tags, then making sure you got them all, and guarding those facilities so no one got in to replace those, was far more work than simply creating a new set of hidden bunkers and so on. After all, they were ninja, so their enemies were ninja too. You'd never be entirely sure that you'd gotten all of the tricks and traps removed. Odds were you likely hadn't. Every village had their own experts in obscure and oddball stuff. No one could know enough to check for them all. It was, in the midst of this frenzy of activity, that Sarutobi had noticed how calm Naruto was. The boy had just gotten married, to a fairly large crowd of young girls by most standards. His home was about to be attacked, and yet. It had been in that moment that Sarutobi felt his first serious doubt that Naruto might not having been making up that time travel story all along as an obscure form of prank or attempt to gain recognition. What he'd seen back in that office had nearly convinced Sarutobi. There, on Naruto's face, was not the expression of a warrior whose home was about to be assaulted or destroyed, nor was it the face of an ignorant child who was innocent of the dangers posed. It hadn't even been the face of a hidden traitor who had helped to bring the whole thing about. It had been the face of an old campaigner, who'd been through it all before and who would survive to do it all again, a man who did not have to frantically get ready, as he was always ready, all of the time. Naruto hadn't even been aware of how much he'd changed when he hadn't felt the need to keep his masks on, but to the Hokage it had been far greater than the contrast between an anxious new student preparing to go off for his first day of classes, carefully frantic to get all of the books and things gathered together, making sure they were presentable, then unable to sleep the night before for all of the excitement, and one who has been attending the same schedule for many years. Sarutobi had realized then that it had become a routine for the boy to have his home village be invaded. There was no mystery for him to it, no anxiety or uncertainty, nothing that it could present to him was entirely new. He was completely familiar with every aspect of it. It had been in that moment that Sarutobi realized that Arashi's child had seen more of carnage, chaos, war, and death than he himself had, and the boy had not lived through any of the last few ninja wars, as he'd done. In that second he could fully believe the boy's outrageous story. Of course the second had passed, as seconds always do, leaving the Hokage to second-guess his moment of discovery. But it had given him pause enough to stop what he'd been doing, fold his hands upon the desk before him, and ask, "So, Naruto, what are your plans for the future?" The Hokage had meant the invasion, but it strengthened his suspicion when the child told him, "Use the memories to train everyone up to meet this the next time, of course." Naruto said it with such a casual, uncaring shrug that Sarutobi got chilled. "I meant for our immediate future, the invasion?" the elderly man corrected. Once more Naruto had shrugged. "Observe the enemy's placements, like usual. They always change them when we alter our own deployment. Then, see if they can score any casualties on our shelters in spite of the new setup. If they can, that probably means that someone aside from Kabuto's team are funneling him information. So that will be something to look for next time, trying to identify who those other sources are." Once again, it had been about what he'd do when this all started over again. The Hokage had begun to experience real doubts in that moment. So, with a smile, he tested the theory. "And how are you planning to implant those memories?" he'd asked. "I understand the Yamanaka clan was less than helpful or forthcoming on those clan secrets of theirs. But even if you knew them all, there is the rather small matter of how to pass those back to their original owners. The illusion techniques are rather demanding." In that moment Sarutobi pegged the mannerisms Naruto had been using. The blonde was unguarded just then, having told his secret and not been believed, so he'd not been bothering to disguise his real feelings, as he so often did. To Sarutobi's startled eyes back then Naruto had been like a baker talking about making bread. There'd been no fear he couldn't do it, no uncertainty or nervousness. This had been just something he had done for a very long time, and Naruto had been unconcerned with how this particular recipe turned out, as he had many others to rely on. It had been a realization that made Sarutobi feel old. Seeing children turn out as hardened soldiers was something he'd worked hard to avoid by bringing peace to Konoha for those past many years. Then the boy had actually yawned before making his reply. Yawned. The rest of the village had been in an uproar about the coming invasion and how to prepare for it, while Arashi's child had yawned. Not even the Hokage could be that blasé about the upcoming fights, to be so relaxed in the face of them. Scratching himself, the boy had replied to the Hokage's question, "Well, they did try to keep them secret, but I figured out enough from what Ino showed me to make the copies. That's the big part. With those, I can afford to take a couple of resets on learning how to implant them. What I think I'll do is get you excited over the prospect of having my memories of that fight against Orochimaru in the Forest of Death part of the exam, so you'll send me off to Kurenai to learn how to do that whole memory share thing. I'll only have half a day, at most, each time to learn the techniques, but I can cut it down to a 2-day repeat set to maximize learning time over a minimal wait period, then use the in-between time to practice whatever exercises she gives me." That could actually work. Sarutobi had briefly considered it from the boy's perspective for once. Yes, his plan is totally independent of me right now. That thought had made him visibly feel even older. Useless was one thing no one ever desired to be. Instead of dealing with that horrible thought, the Hokage had pulled down a blank piece of paper and begun to write upon it. Having presented the newly sealed note to Naruto, he'd said, "Here, this will authorize you to claim enough of Kurenai's time to give you a basic familiarity with the illusion you seek." The Hokage had taken a deep breath, then forced a smile. Good luck, Naruto." The blonde had accepted the note with a surprised glance, but got businesslike in how quickly he vanished to go make use of it. Exactly as an experienced, professional shinobi should be. The utter professionalism of those moments had destroyed the Hokage's doubts further. But Naruto, by then, was gone. Aye. Naruto had become the Hokage's hat so that, no matter what happened, he could be with the old man up until his very last moments, as he figured that the more information he returned with, the more likely he was to convince his Gramps of this story the next time, even if he failed with the mind thingy. Obviously, that hadn't worked. Stupid grumbling stomach. He hadn't even gotten to see the look on the Hokage's face as his headwear had growled like that. He'd have to plan that as a prank sometime. Still, Naruto was not incautious on other matters, having captured memories from all of his wives before that last day had even started. He'd hoped to have updated them at the last moments, but understood the fighting could be so chaotic that was far from guaranteed to happen. Still, his clones had known enough to have made last copies right at the end of the last of their matches, after everyone but Sasuke had fought, as the last time they'd been through a wedding repeat, that had been the last safe and sane moment where copying those memories could be done. Really, Ino hadn't known enough, and the rest of her family wouldn't teach him enough, to make that memory copy process work as it ought to. Naruto had been forced to fall back upon his old academy habits of knowing only just enough to puzzle out the rest. So his memory copy jutsu was unmastered, barely even tested. However, the time-looping boy was now mature enough to accept that not all of his plans had to succeed on the first attempt. But even though one had to accept failures when they happened, it also helped to provide for success, so he'd spent most of that last reset working to build the relationships he had with his girls, providing them with the best weddings and conversations he knew how, just in case that all had worked. Of course, that being a wedding reset, there had still come a confrontation with Hinata's father, and that hadn't grown any less inelegant. Sarutobi had been even less amused about the lost Anbu, with the invasion to consider, and the whole village hating him, then confused about his bloodline and father and all, was a heavy burden for those girls to consider. Still, although it hadn't been perfect, it had been as good as Naruto knew how to do for his girls, which wasn't at all bad. On the other hand, for other people it was worse. Although Naruto hadn't put much thought into it, Gaara could get away with killing Konoha ninja because he wasn't one himself. He was from Sand, which gave him some leeway, as it placed him outside of the Konoha justice system without provoking a serious diplomatic incident much like the war they'd been preparing for, or the one with Cloud they'd barely avoided. And, as an admitted psychopath, he had still more leeway. You provoke one of those when you know what you are doing and most see it as you deserving what you get. Still, that would have done nothing more than delay those repercussions, but for the way that whole thing got resolved. If Naruto or another ninja of Konoha had tried anything close to the same level of force to stop Hayashi's attempt to curse Hinata, they could have been dealt with at once, immediately bringing down a full-force reprisal. To have even resisted peacefully could have triggered an immediate assault by Hayashi and his men, who could have excused themselves later. Which had been something of the Hyuga's plan all along. Hayashi had always run around those rules he found inconvenient by operating on the phrase, "It is easier to get forgiveness than permission." A simple excuse of, "the demon brat used force on my men, so we replied," could have gotten him forgiven of murder, even though he'd been the one to use force in the first place. He would ride it through by catering to those who had not been there, or subverting those who had been to his side, using the fact that they wanted to believe the worst of Naruto to get himself out of any blame for having openly provoked a confrontation, then destroyed him. Whereas, getting permission to execute Naruto beforehand was something that Sarutobi could and had blocked before. So, if any Konoha ninja had replied when Hayashi sent his men out in attacks of one sort or another, that could only have ended with the victims of Hayashi's assault blamed for provoking those attacks in the first place. Consider him what you will, never deny that the Hyuga clan head was a wily political opponent. Getting others to bear the blame for his own deeds was paltry to him. However, when Gaara had been the first to use lethal force, that became an international incident. That kicked it up to the next level, where it could not be ignored by those in Konoha who turned a blind eye toward injustice so long as Naruto was the only, or primary, victim. They could no longer afford to act with impunity in that case, as they had to consider how it would look to other villages. And the plain simple fact of the matter was that Hayashi's house invasion looked bad any way that you turned it. There was no good way to break the fact that they'd been going to the home of a family not married one full day to put a seal used only for torture and death on one of the brides who was also the clan heiress of the person who would have been putting that curse seal on her. The other villages all had their own ninja. They knew better than to believe whatever pretty face Konoha tried to staple over such an incident. Most would even find out that Hayashi and his party had been belligerent and hostile, openly provoking a fight while performing their gruesome task. There was no way for them to disguise that, and to any village other than Konoha, Naruto had plain and uncontested authority over his wife as part of his new clan, and that the old one should have gone piss up a rope. No one, outside of Konoha, could or would fault Gaara for having resisted that with whatever force he felt was necessary. To most, those who died were about to break law by taking Hinata away when Naruto had authority over her as part of his new clan. And it would have cost Konoha their nice guy image rather completely to have such a story get out. Konoha enjoyed a substantial portion of their business due to the nice guy image they tried to present. Hidden Mist, while they had extremely effective ninja, had a substantial portion of the available customer base who simply wouldn't touch them due to their fearsome reputation as ninja who had to kill their own comrades to graduate. Who could trust a ninja who had already killed his own friends? Then, of course, it was proved, but only after Hayashi had pushed to get his way and provoked a defensive response that left several dead, that even by the bloodline-favoring laws of Konoha, the Hyuga clan was in the wrong, as Naruto had an equivalent bloodline, and thus equal if not superior rights. Hayashi had overstepped his bounds many times before he'd gotten away with it to others' cost. This time that equation had been reversed. Sarutobi could no more prevent all the deaths of Konoha ninja than he could stop the leaves from falling. Those lives had not been lost to his order, nor to any fault of Naruto's. If he had not resisted, or more accurately, called in Gaara to resist and protect them, Hinata at least would have been put under a caged bird seal, if not killed. What Sarutobi had known, and considered, that Naruto had not experience enough to predict for himself was that it would have been too much for Hayashi to resist having used the seal upon his daughter almost the moment it was placed, torturing her right there before her husband in hopes of provoking him to combat. There had been a reason so many ANBU loyal to Hyuga had gone that day, and why the Hokage had been looking so grim. It had been Sarutobi's belief that he knew the man enough to guess that the Hyuga clan head had a long speech prepared to deliver as he slowly, tortuously killed his own child, all about how it was better that she should die than her noble bloodline should be sullied by the taint carried by the boy she'd married. Those might not have been the exact words, but Sarutobi had believed it would have been along those lines, deliberately insulting on top of the injury in the hopes of provoking combat, which Hayashi could then use as an excuse to have killed Naruto, and perhaps every member of that small family as well, just to wipe the entire slate clean. It was not as if such things had not happened before. No, Sarutobi had regretted the loss of those ANBU, but before they'd even gone to the compound it was clear that some death was going to be delivered that day, and he could not blame Naruto for it. No, he'd been there mostly to intervene when and if he could, and that had proved unnecessary. However, as he later faced the invasion, the Hokage dearly wished that he could have prevented it all, as those experienced ninja would be so useful for it. But if he could have stopped it all, he never would have permitted that procession to Naruto's clan compound in the first place. None of this affected Naruto's plans as he gleefully sprang forth on the morning of the reset to go and try out his new jutsu to see if he really could implant those new memories and see if his friends could recall just what had gone on before the reset. Hinata-chan? Darling? Wake up. Hinata knew she was dreaming, as that was her Naruto-kun's voice and she had heard him call her darling. How could that be real? She knew that despite how much she loved him, the boy whose many qualities she admired barely even knew she existed. He thought she was weird. No, I do not think you're weird, Hinata darling. I think you are very cute, and your kisses are to die for. See? She hadn't kissed anyone ever. She was shy to begin with, and no one else seemed half as interesting to her as Naruto. Ah, you're making me blush, Hinata-chan. For what it's worth, I love you too. And with that, the startled girl sat up in her bed with a gasp, only to see her crush standing there beside her. Before she could say a word, though, he had snuck in and touched her lips with his, before backing off to say, "There, now I've had your first kiss, and I've got to say that it made me want another, in fact, a whole lot more of your kisses. But for now I am going to have to settle for offering you this." He held out his hand towards her, and sitting there in his palm was a point of lavender light, glittering like a jewel. Even without her bloodline active, she was able to recognize it as visible chakra, which meant it had to be really intense and focused. She honestly hadn't thought he'd gotten that far in his studies, as whatever it was truly advanced. Hinata met Naruto's eyes. "I've died and gone to heaven, haven't I?" she asked in a trembling voice, then smiled at him. "I always knew you would be here." But then her eyes widened, and she leapt out of bed and grabbed him. "But Naruto-kun, you can't have died yet. You haven't reached your dream and made Hokage." He quieted her with a kiss, which was as effective as it was soothing. She'd raised her voice a bit during the last exclamation, and it would not do for angry family members to overhear shouting and look to see what was going on. No, that wouldn't do at all. "Hinata-chan, being with you is more important to me than being Hokage, or anything else that I can think of." She melted. "Now," he tenderly offered her the point of light again. "This belongs to you, and I want you to have it. Someone who loves us both wants you to have it, too." He was referring to her future self, the one with 1 month and 8 days more experience than she had at present. Of course, the current girl had no way of knowing that, and knew of no one who loved her Naruto-kun and her. Come to think of it, she knew of no one besides her who loved Naruto-kun, and for that matter she couldn't name one soul who loved her. Well, aside from him. He just said it, and that made this heaven, and so what he was offering to her could not be bad, as they didn't do bad things to each other in heaven. Heaven was a place where everyone was nice and kind. Hell was a place where all the cruel and nasty people had only each other to be mean to. Perhaps her mother had wanted her to have this. She was in heaven too, so if Naruto-kun was here as well, they'd probably met, and how could she not like him? Doubts resolved at last, the young girl reached for the chakra jewel he offered her. And remembered. There was a whole month in there of having been married to her Naruto-kun. Oh, and there was some other stuff as well, but married to her Naruto-kun. That kind of dwarfed everything else. For Naruto, either part of this whole memory transfer thing had been easy. But then again, very little in his short life had been easy. In the first place, he'd not had the Yamanaka's ability to parse through memories so easily, and they were stored all over the place, so he'd kind of just sucked Ino and the rest into his mind, showed them around the place, including the cage with the Kyuubi sleeping peacefully, wounds almost healed by now, and then taken them upstairs to give them a room. Naruto had no official verbiage or technical jargon for what he'd done. He couldn't adequately explain it, not even if he knew language describing how. It had been a bit like moving his hand. It all functioned on so deep a level that it didn't even register on a conscious one, he merely did it. However, in the mansion of his mindscape, each of those girls who married him had their own rooms. He'd help them move in stuff and get settled. They had closets with favorite outfits, hairbrushes and the works, with little wedding mementos, pictures and photos and picture frames, and so on. There was even a little Hinata in there, asleep on the bed that he'd made for her, only now that Hinata had just woken up and was exclaiming all over things. Out in the outside world, Hinata had glommed onto her husband with all of the force available in her young body, and was currently mashing her lips to his before going searching for a furry tail that she could cuddle. It went much the same way with each those other girls, as his clones woke them up in other parts of town, with the mindscape version of herself waking up as the link got re-established, and all of them reaching in to spend a few moments recalling all of the memories they'd stored in there. It had worked. Only, this being their first reset, it took each of them a while to become used to the idea of this not being the end of the Chunin exam, but instead only just the beginning. Still, Naruto was happy to take them each by the hand and show them things that could convince them. He had whole catalogs of facts to point out by then, and they had all of the time in the world together to get used to it. All that while he couldn't stop grinning. He had his friends again. Perhaps, yes, just perhaps, he had the first real friends ever. The boy simply could not stop grinning. Aye. Of course, no sooner had it been proved to everyone that the resets were real and the memories had happened, time just got turned back, then the immediate priority became training. Lots and lots of training. Because, you see, they all had an opportunity here. Naruto had never even come close to being able to pass on all he'd learned before. There just wasn't time, only now they had all of the time in the world. The girls could only learn things Naruto knew. Well, perhaps that could be better stated by saying he could only teach what he knew, but they also had those same limits that restricted him, namely nothing physical could change. By using the Sharingan, albeit briefly, and those pangs of yearning for it had still not left him entirely alone, he'd wake up sometimes still wanting to go out and challenge the whole town just to learn all of the jutsu and moves used in Konoha. Naruto had implanted muscle memories of what he'd learned up until that point. Now he was left in the condition of someone who was out of shape for what he'd been doing. His mind knew what it was doing, and so did his body, but while his body knew, it didn't necessarily have the refined capabilities to do it, just like an athlete that has stopped practicing for a while. He knew, but he was rusty, having lost his edge, as the fitness freaks would call it. Never mind that he was far better now than he'd ever been, that was how they'd see it, because that was the only condition in their experience that could properly explain it. Both he and his body had the movements programmed in, but all of those tiny little adjustments practice made to the muscles were lacking. So, while he had very good skills indeed, they weren't all they could be. Naruto's muscle memory-powered martial arts were indeed about twice as good as they'd been before. He'd gone from top Genin to low Chunin. But he'd probably be a substantial step closer to mid Chunin if he could have that last little bit, the added flexibility, power and toughness that came from those calluses and things he couldn't form while caught in a repeat. Not that he expected to get him. It just helped to be aware of the issues that were holding one back, as those same things would be holding back the girls. Actually, he had a good perspective on that from his training under Guy and Lee. Those martial arts specialists had ceaselessly encouraged him in their own particular way, and Guy had, more than once, complimented him on his ability to pick up their style. That was the thing, in the strong fist style practiced by those two, he'd already had the reflexes, picked up by the Sharingan from watching Lee, first fighting Sasuke, and then in the prelims against himself. But having that had interested Guy less than Naruto's work-developed ability to learn them mentally. Apparently, having to learn the academy martial arts style by having carefully memorized each and every step, along with the exact placement of each limb and joint as he did so, then having to do that all over again when the Kyuubi gave him that unwanted growth spurt, had trained Naruto's mind in the ability to pick up and study martial arts. In layman's terms, he'd learned how to learn them. Having had to focus in on every exacting detail, not just once but twice, had granted Naruto an understanding of how to learn and study martial arts, one that even Guy found impressive. Not that those two were about to call it a gift, in fact they would have been severely hurt had he not confessed to having done it through a great deal of hard work, at which point they'd embraced him, shouting his name, with the sunset over the sea in the background, one of the most touching and acceptance-laden moments of his young life, and dearly cherished for that. But no, he picked up the mental aspects of their strong fist style faster than just about anyone, and since he could only claim hard work as his advantage, that had only spurred Lee on harder and even faster. Now, he had the same ability to pursue that with Hinata, learning her gentle fist style, as one thing Naruto had learned early on was that it taught you things you hadn't known you'd known to teach something to someone else. So Hinata could benefit powerfully from teaching him her family's style. For that matter, they'd all practice it. Because from what little practice Naruto had given that art already, he'd learned that it made for some great chakra control exercises, if nothing else. Besides, bloodline theft was on the horizon someplace, so it wasn't entirely out of the question that at some point in the future they could be able to use that style as well as any of the Hyugas. Not that they'd be great, because those same disadvantages still holding him back would still be there, but for the situation they were in, the Hyuga's gentle fist style was better for them than Guy's strong fist. That was because the strong fist depended on massive physical development, huge and intensive training programs leading to a fitness level that verged on the insane. And they simply couldn't do that, as it wouldn't improve them a bit. Naruto had learned how. He'd been through those intensive training regimes alongside both Guy and Lee. He knew how to push his body beyond its normal limits, felt the burn, got a real workout, and so he'd gotten the knowledge and ability to exercise on that level. He just didn't want to do so uselessly, and so had been holding back on it until he felt it could do him some good. But the gentle fist, with its soft deflection instead of hard blocks, was better suited to them now, when they couldn't become physical powerhouses. It wasn't that the art was any less demanding or that they weren't limited still by their inability to benefit speed or endurance through exercise, but that the style's focus on soft forms made it capable of using what they had far more efficiently. Hinata, sadly, would likely never beat Niji in a straight-up fight using the Hyuga style, as the older boy had developed insane speed into his body that now she couldn't match. Skill-wise, however, she could come a great deal closer, if not surpass him. Another thing they'd all want to practice was throwing weapons. Naruto had gone from being able to hit 40% of the time, instead of Tenten's 100%, all the way up to 80, half that still, with the exotic garbage not meant to be thrown. Still, 80% of the time was not bad, and it could do Hinata a world of good to throw junk at Niji, or that chakra-stealing guy instead of having to face them in close combat. Similarly, Tenten could gain a great deal of edge on future opponents if she had some close combat capacity instead of being all-ranged. Actually, though, her most frequent opponent was still going to be Temari. They'd have to do something about that. Temari could be strongly benefited by having those two specialties added to her own, just as they could be substantially aided by having access to her wind techniques. Ino didn't feel like she'd be contributing much, until Naruto teasingly pointed out that it was her, and her family techniques, that was making all of this training possible. Hana had no doubts of her own usefulness, and put up with no nonsense from any of the younger females. She was clearly the alpha female of this pack, being the oldest and highest-ranking ninja among them. Besides, her clan techniques could be among the most useful of all to them, as between that beast mimicry and some others, they could be using chakra to boost up their otherwise permanently stalled physical prowess. Ayam, who Hinata had insisted they bring along, had been content to quietly make meals for everyone, until Hana made it clear that she wouldn't allow it. The ramen stand owner's daughter had never been a ninja, but in Hana's eyes that ended the moment she became a member of a ninja pack who were in a position to potentially save their village when no one else could. As alpha female, management of the younger bitches fell under her authority, and Hana had already decided to make the waitress into a ninja because she felt they needed every bit of help they could get on this assignment, and she was available. So, before any of the other members of the pack had anything to say about it, Ayam's tutoring in the ninja arts was already happening. There was enough of Naruto about to help with all that had to be done, of course, and one of the first things he'd wanted to teach them all was his version of the shadow clone technique. Hey, it was enormously useful as a training tool. It didn't much matter if each of 10 clones had only 1/10 the chakra if they were learning things like Naruto's civilian trades. And for most control exercises, a limited capacity was only a small detriment. Sparring and martial arts practice, so long as they were strictly martial arts moves, would not be hindered in the least. So, for most of what he had to teach them, the ability to make clones was a big step up on everything they wanted to do. Luckily, he'd had a ton of practice training Tenten in this, so it didn't even take a whole reset for every member of that small family, including Ayam, to have that technique down to where they could use it. He'd also had enough practice teaching her how to make explosive tags that went quickly too, spreading over everyone in the same short amount of time. Getting everyone to do the basic chakra control exercises taught to him by the scroll of Ebisus, the one listing out how to develop elemental affinities, was another useful thing to start, and although that didn't have as quick results, he didn't expect them to be fast on that. Having memories about losing their Chunin exam final fights was proving to be very motivational to the girls, not because they hated their opponents or wanted revenge particularly, but, as Naruto warned them, if you get into a fight you can't win during those resets, then you tend to get beat up an awful lot. Since no one likes to get beaten, least of all tender young girls, they practiced hard to bring their skills up. All of this time, while Naruto had clones training each of his girls, he also had more out there continuing to practice his own exercises and training, in both chakra control and everything else. And when the real him got over being giddy that he had real friends again, ones he could hang out with and who'd understand him, whose every reaction he couldn't predict anymore, well, then it was time for him to celebrate by working on whole new stuff. He'd gotten a breakthrough while practicing on seals to use to adapt Hana's armor to her despite her clan techniques tending to bulge and swell certain parts of the body, muscles and such, but also teeth and forming fingernails into claws and so on. It was a great battle technique, but Naruto hadn't been able to use as much of it as he would have liked because of those shifts constricting the fit of his armor, so in the really serious fights it had always been a choice which to use, the Inuzuka clan techniques or his laboriously produced protection. But in trying to resolve that for Hana, he made a discovery that ought to help them all out enormously. Naruto found bits of what he'd wanted described in completely unrelated seals, found out how to isolate and combine those bits he'd wanted through the process of experimenting, losing several hundreds clones to do it, and at the end had created a new seal array, a very minor one in most ways, not very large or complicated at all. However, it didn't have to be complex to be useful. No, Naruto's new seal could be placed on a suit of armor, or clothes, as he later discovered, and once linked to a user it could shift that suit in sync with changes to their body, so that it would always have the exact same fit regardless of issues like growth from natural development, or temporary chakra-based body-enhancing techniques. It basically just linked the two so the body and the armor changed in sync. It was so small a seal array that he could even hide it in the hems of clothes so that no one, not even the wearer, had to know it was there. So those wardrobes he'd learned how to create for his beloved females, and that were the envy of half of Konoha, could now be created again with impunity if he were to desire to do so. It didn't solve the problem of him becoming a famous tailor, but it did solve the issue of them growing out of those carefully fitted ninja outfits over the month or so before the exam finals. And now he and Hana could use those Inuzuka clan techniques wearing armor. Which meant, if he really wanted to, he could now design suits that were much thicker, as the increased strength granted out of beast mimicry would allow them to bear that properly. It couldn't be made to stop Orochimaru's sword or Manda's teeth, frankly, what could, but against anything in the light to mid-range of power, which was most of what everyone threw in combat except for certain rare heavy hitters like they mostly happened to be up against, it should do fine. So the armor began to appear again, with more confidence this time. Actually, Naruto had a great deal of fun there, as now that those girls could be consulted they had more ideas and imagination to throw things about and bounce ideas back and forth. And Temari, being the daughter of the Kage of Sand, a country which dealt mostly in metals and metal goods, had learned enough by overhearing casual conversations and such to be able to suggest other metals and possibly alloys for Naruto to experiment with. That proved to be an eye-opener, as previously he'd done most of his work in steel, although he'd also done some copper cookware for the sake of it. However, though they were more expensive and harder to find people who could teach him to work in them, there were some other materials. Titanium in particular was both lighter and stronger than steel, having the highest strength-to-weight ratio of any metal, although it wasn't something an ordinary blacksmith could just casually set a hammer to. For one, it didn't bear metal fatigue as well as steel did, so hammering wasn't the best way to work it. But that was mostly a moot point, as it was too dang tough to work by hand. Well, it could be done, it just was far from easy. And the heat at which the stuff had to be smelted and tempered was just slightly short of unreal. Not being easy had never stopped Naruto in the best of times, and he'd been practicing fire affinity for months by letting a blazing fire burn near him without getting him so much as warm. So, between fire techniques to heat the flames, chakra control exercises to protect him, and beast mimicry to hammer and shape the stuff, he could gradually learn to work it over time. However, his real breakthrough there occurred when he started to design his own techniques, using what he already knew as a base, to help him out in the forge, using first fire to heat the metal, then earth to form solid crushing dies to squash that metal in between and form the proper shapes that way. It was rough and crude, and titanium had a memory so that it tended to spring back into what it had been before, which was great once you had it in the form of armor, as it could thus more easily resist blows. But that ability to resist blows was far from ideal when you were trying to hammer it into the form of that armor to begin with. No, in most ways the stuff could just be a nightmare to work with, so he began to refine that through frequent experimentation, a process that had as a natural side effect the fact that he began playing with alloy mixtures, different grades, and processes for mixing the steel he already knew how to work with. Even in the narrow range that made up steel, mixtures of carbon and iron could form a number of different structures, all of which had very different properties, most of which the smiths of the elemental countries had never explored properly. One problem he got trying to forge the new stuff was that titanium burned at temperatures less than required to melt it, when exposed to air. Cooling the new material properly also turned out to be a real bear, and the stuff just didn't want to work into intricate shapes with the precision necessary for the tasks he had to hand, using the methods he had available. But he persevered, learning new methods and, when he had to, inventing some, creating entirely new ninja techniques useful for nothing else but to help him craft stuff out of titanium. Then, to get a sufficient supply of that hard-to-obtain metal, enough to outfit his whole small family, he adapted some of his earth chakra control exercises to separate out minuscule particles of titanium from out of the ground. Once he had that down, he sent his clones out far and wide, searching the boundaries of the territory he could reach, surveying for that useful mineral, as well as certain others Temari had told him about. And of course, this was really nothing more than a side venture to him, as his real time and attention was focused on the fun he was having now that he had people to share his life. But the best of experiences can make for boring retelling. Naruto had never actually collected the Hokage's memories, as he'd been waiting for the right moment, so he could get them all, and his silly rumbling tummy had stopped all that from happening. Still, he did have that compressed 3 days into 1 second illusion that he'd developed for that purpose. The only flaw with that technique was that he didn't have absolute control over the territory the illusion created. It basically drew one person into the mind of the other, and they both had power to affect that mindscape if they wanted to, so it wasn't something you'd want to use on an enemy. But it was useful for the one thing he'd developed it for: training. He'd hoped to use it on the old guy a second or so before his death, so they could set up a memory cache together at their leisure. Right now, he was developing it to use along with the training program for Lee, getting the green-clad gen in a suite of chakra techniques once he'd finished that experimental medical process to get the disabled boy's coils functioning properly. And he was working big time on how to do that for his old friend. Ninja medicine was about what you'd expect, as it met a ninja's typical needs, and mainly those came in the form of stab wounds, burns, shocks, and the like. In short, it was trauma medicine at its finest. But Naruto had identified 2 areas that it lacked in already. One of those was in disease control. They frankly weren't very good at it when compared to their trauma specialty, but the other was in degenerative conditions. Into this last field also fell such things as incomplete generation. Lee's chakra coils had never finished their development. That was it. That was all, just a certain vital part of his body had never completely grown into what it ought to be. That sort of thing happened with some frequency, and they were generally known as birth defects. Sometimes the person having them died, like when the heart had incompletely formed, or sometimes the person was completely normal in all ways but had something crippling like no legs. Lee's chakra coils fell in that latter department. However, this was something that the injury-focused ninja medical science had not addressed. The doctor at the clinic giving lessons who'd used Lee as an example had been thinking in terms of surgery to repair, replace, or reconstruct those coils, a daunting prospect indeed. Naruto, who'd been doing explorations into bloodline theft, had just absorbed all of the hospital's recorded knowledge on that subject, and had a different idea. Bloodline theft could be accomplished a number of different ways. You could either get a hold of someone who had that bloodline you wanted and breed up your own supply of them. That was actually how Konoha got most of theirs, but it was slow and depended on their willing support of your project. The next level up was to use the affected part, like an eye or whatever, and just implant that directly using surgery. But those people couldn't breed those advantages into future generations of ninja. Neither of those required any particular skill. However, the third method was where the real payoff occurred. That was where you got the most results the fastest. And unlike a transplant, you had a number of breedable people more or less right away. There were a number of techniques for growing cells quickly. That came as a standard part of most of the advanced healing skills. The third method of bloodline theft came about only when a highly skilled medic used it, but they would take a sample of the bloodline-carrying genes and grow those across and into the genetic structure of an otherwise normal adult body. Unlike both other methods, that gave you several adult bloodline carriers right away. That was obviously the method Naruto was hoping for, even though the best genetic structures used for this generally had to be extracted from tender internal parts. It was what gave the best results, so what he was aiming for. But it was, admittedly, a very advanced art, and so one that very few medics could perform successfully. He was just aiming to be one of those, naturally. Unfortunately, they couldn't do it from mere genes alone, so what had to happen most often was a tissue graft from the donor would be implanted and used as a starting point to seed those genes across the rest of a body. But that wouldn't hurt him for very long anyway. Eyes made for an extremely bad tissue sample to work from, or else Kakashi could have been made into a full-blooded Uchiha with 2 Sharingan eyes and full control over them, just as naturally adept as Sasuke and Itachi. The thing that tied this back to Lee, in Naruto's insightful mind, was that if they could promote cells and even genes to grow in unnatural ways, it ought to be much, much easier to convince a body to finish growing out in normal, natural ones that had, for whatever reason, paused at incomplete stages. So Naruto was working on that, and a part of how he was working on that was trying to sprout plant bulbs from Ino's shop. They weren't animal, but they were alive, so he felt that medical techniques ought to have some use on them. And experimenting on animals just seemed too icky. Meanwhile, Ino had a wonderful opportunity to bug her family for more of the clan techniques. Since she wasn't obviously married to the village pariah, he and she both knew, along with some other girls, but no one else in town recalled that ceremony, so it was a bit like being secretly engaged, and had a good excuse in that she was in the midst of the Chunin exam. She had a decent argument for swaying them. No luck, Ino sighed, rejoining the group despondent. Dad says that he won't teach me anything more until I've got more mastery of what they already taught me. The girls, looking at Naruto and expecting him to be despondent, got a shock to see him looking gleeful. Matching their gazes, he cackled, rubbing his hands together in a fake villain way. Excellent. The girls were dumbfounded, so he explained, giving them all a glad shrug. It's no big deal, really. Your dad did the next best thing to saying, "Yeah, sure. I'll train you." But he just said he won't. Ino protested, confused over how he could not be getting this. But Naruto was already shaking his head, instructing them with a gleam in his eyes. No, he said he won't train you yet. That's a very important qualifier. So, we practice what you already know on each other, and next reset or so you go up to him, and, this is the fun part, don't ask him for more of your family techniques. Instead, you'll ask him for help mastering what you've already got. Then, at some point probably not too far away, he'll realize, wow, my little princess is better at this than I thought. I guess it's time to train her up to the next level. Ino sat stunned as Naruto copied her father's voice and tones precisely. Those words were even the kind of phrases her daddy would use. Naruto had leaned back and crossed his arms behind his head, shrugging. He told them, "Don't forget, we're in a time loop. There's all the opportunities we could want to get something right. If it doesn't work the first time, try again. And your dad gave it to you on a silver platter. All you've got to do now is approach him after we've practiced you up some. Then he'll see that your skills have improved, he'll think you're ready for the next step, and if he doesn't see that himself you can ask again, or if not him then your mom, or whoever you could convince. It's simple, really." They all blinked at that thought, not used to thinking in terms of resets or doing those same actions over again with only slight variation, hoping to get better results. Oh well, they'd learn. Naruto had several fairly short resets in mind, as currently he was hoping to examine the curse seal Orochimaru kept putting on Sasuke, and the best time to do that was when it was still stabilizing itself. After all, having seen the snake guy implant the thing using that long neck jutsu of his, while under his temporary Sharingan, Naruto had a fair idea of how the whole curse seal thing worked. Well, no. That must be restated. The Sharingan taught nothing of the hows and whys of a jutsu, not even the whens or wheres, only the what. It gave you the ability to do something without having to understand how you did it, just like punching the buttons on a remote control didn't grant you power to understand the device that it operated. It didn't teach you under what circumstances it would be best to use the wheres, or the best times to use it, the whens, although when it was active it could help you time things by showing you what an opponent was up to and thus what openings he'd be leaving. That still wasn't you, that was the Sharingan, nor did it suggest you know, now would be a great time to use X. That wasn't its job. The Sharingan copied things. It gave the ability to use them. It was experience that taught the rest, and most who had the special eyes didn't bother learning anything more than what their eyes taught them. Most did not even maintain a catalog of their arsenal, not even bothering to recall their stolen techniques unless reminded, usually by someone else using them on them. It seemed that arrogance and laziness were an essential part of the design. However, Naruto had learned the what of several of Orochimaru's special techniques by using that, and included among those were the long neck thing and how to place a cursed seal on someone. A curse seal that would make them loyal to Orochimaru, so that wasn't something he was ever intending to do, but still, by calming the must-learn more jutsu urge accompanying the memory of that week, Naruto was able to sit down and think through the process of how he would go about placing a curse seal without actually doing it. Basically, he let his reflexes ride with the thought on a practice dummy while his conscious mind stood back and watched. Then he did it again and then again, until he had some of the hows figured out. It didn't grant him the whys or anything like that, but by observing himself as he went through the technique he managed to pick up more than the simple shortcut carved into his mind by the Sharingan, and understanding on a level of, here is fist. Punch! Using techniques taught by the Sharingan was akin to punching a button on a remote control, as far as difficulty went. Point and click was about the comprehension of the inner workings of those techniques it granted, just like most couch potatoes had no understanding of the depth of complexity in the remote control in their hands, or the target it affected. And if you could actually recall what each of those buttons did, he supposed that could be an advantage, as it could make nearly anyone into a ninja. But with all of the work being done by the Sharingan, it could also make nearly anyone into a lazy, selfish bastard. Or at least, so he supposed. But that's what everyone he knew who had the Uchiha's special eyes were. Still, by now, having mastered so many tricks on his own, it was maddening to the boy to have no comprehension at all of the details behind most of his new moves. He could learn a lot by doing them when he had clones to observe, and if he paid close attention to his own body he could learn still more. Still, that wasn't half the level of detail you'd find on any decent scroll. And Naruto was going to all of this trouble because knowing how to implant the thing did not, in any way, shape or form, grant him the ability to remove it. The Uchiha could be his test subject, but what he really wanted to do was learn how to remove it for Anko's sake, not his. He liked Anko, and she didn't like her curse seal. Sadly, either of those were true about Sasuke. Tenten was not the sort of girl who typically sat on top of the Hokage monument looking out over Konoha and thinking. It usually wasn't her style. She hadn't had a bad life, and while she never had much of a family, there had always been a close circle of friends, although since graduating her duties as a ninja had largely overshadowed them. That had been alright, as her team had largely replaced them, or the time she wasn't spending with her normal friends anymore, at any rate, and she even got a substitute parent out of that bargain. Although, something took the fun out of that. She was a teenage girl, and so in some ways expected to rebel against her parents. But Guy made it so easy. All you had to do was not be dressed in a freakish way, not dedicate your life to muscle development, or shout about the power of youth, and you had a semi-comfortable distance from your parental figure. Niji had seemed so normal, too. The girl huffed a sigh. That romance had gone south there, never truly taken off, if she was going to be honest with herself. The Hyuga prodigy may be powerful, but he had less personality than Naruto's little finger. And speaking of Naruto, how could anyone get themselves in this kind of mess? Oh, okay, she knew about the Kyuubi thing. He'd even shown her the vixen's cage, and the barn-sized animals sleeping inside. Well, not even Naruto knew how this time loop thing had started happening, so that was pointless conjecture to pursue it. So Tenten, being an ever-practical girl, counted up her pluses and minuses. And, as she stepped back to look at it, she had a great deal of the former, and only a few of the latter. On the plus side, Naruto was an insanely great kisser. And she honestly liked him a lot. He'd been very kind to her. Minuses. Having to share him with other girls. She was still a bit weirded out over how easily he talked her into accepting that. On the plus side, he gave a great massage, and minuses. There was having Hannah treat her as a subordinate little sister. Pluses. Clothes. That one word said it all. She'd never been able to afford much, living on an orphan's allowance, and having to carefully watch her budget. It was all too easy to splurge and end up eating at a friend's house as an unwelcome guest for a couple of weeks, having blown her grocery money on frills and lovelies. Now, she had a closet that could make a few rich girls of her admittedly limited acquaintance blush with envy. It was fabulous. She'd always managed to look good before, but now. She shook her head, as it was entirely too possible to get all caught up on the aspects of her new wardrobe she admired, and that was only a facet of all of the things she had to consider. Although a very pleasant facet, but still. A very pleasant facet indeed, actually. And that, put together with those massages, and those kisses. It was unreal. Shaking herself back out of those thoughts again, the young girl turned again to consider her situation. Naruto was actually a nice guy, something all too scarce in ninja, and he had all the wealth he wanted in the form of the Uchiha estate, and those skills of his, all of which he'd proclaimed his willingness to teach them. Tenten was interested in those weaponsmithing abilities of his, if nothing else, as those just meshed so easily into her already present style. Of course, Naruto wasn't apt to leave them in their comfortable little cubby holes. No, he had her pegged for learning Hinata's clan martial arts, plus the basic academy style to a much greater degree. He wanted to punch all of their chakra control ratings up through the roof, grant them training for gaining elemental affinities, teach them ninjutsu, and she didn't know what all else. Although, add it all up together, and all he'd really wanted to do was make them better kunoichi. Tenten wanted to be a better kunoichi than she was. Her goal had always been to emulate Tsunade, the legendary slug Sannin, and Naruto was already talking about cross-training as medic ninja. Okay. She had to admit, there were limits to how good you could get throwing things at enemy ninja, and she'd pretty much hit that barrier already. Not having a clan or anyone to teach her techniques, her progress had more or less stalled. Naruto had not only blown off all past limits to her progress, he was eager, of all things, to see them do well. That earned points in her book. People eager to see other people succeed were rare, even in this town. Guy was one of them, one of the reasons she'd been so glad to be placed on his team, in spite of his many eccentricities. That Naruto was another earned him a special place in her book. Okay, she had to face it, everything he did was because he wanted her to improve and be better. Not even Guy was so interested in her advancement, although to give her teacher credit, he'd offered to let her try out Lee's training schedule, and she couldn't handle it. Naruto had already taught her shadow clones and explosive tags, more than tripling her ninja arsenal. And if she let him continue, she'd be well on her way to being much closer to a legendary kunoichi like Tsunade. Who was she kidding? He'd had her convinced that the clothes. The guy was a regular sewing miracle. All of the so-called bad stuff was faint by comparison to that. She was sitting there contemplating what had to be the single greatest opportunity of her life, as if she'd been trying to convince herself to find some faults with it. Naruto was kind, loaded, skilled, a great kisser, and determined to help her be the sort of ninja she'd always wanted to be, but never had the opportunity to reach before. She was convinced. Laughing at herself for being so foolish, the girl leapt onto her new giant fan, one her husband admitted had been designed based on Temari's, and allowed herself to float down over Konoha on it. Those wind jutsu were really useful. Temari was content. For Naruto, waking her up and convincing her to accept those memories of hers had been a simple matter of approaching her with the right code phrases she had taught him, to appear to be a secret messenger sent from Sand. None of those were expected on this assignment, but you had to have the capability to send that kind of message at need. So, he had used those code phrases and passcodes, and she had accepted him and his message while still in her bedclothes, no questions asked. And from that chakra jewel he'd offered, recalled everything from before. So now what are we going to be up to? The wind mistress cocked a hip at her husband and asked. Naruto's grin was infectious. Your next element. First, I was going to teach you the few wind techniques I know that you don't, but I figured we'd both be happier if I started you off on Earth instead. She blinked at him. Here he knew she was a wind specialist, and he wanted to teach her about dirt? You do know that mastering 2 elements is one of the requirements for being a Jonin, don't you? From his shocked expression she guessed that he hadn't known that little tidbit. So why Earth? She figured she'd ask to see if he had any special reason. Her husband looked at her guilelessly. Because last time I fought Gaara I used an earth flow river to turn all of his sand into mud. He can't use that stuff when it gets wet, it gets all clumpy and hard for him to control. But if you turn it to mud it gets even worse, as not only is it wet but the particle size drops from sand to silt. So you can practically shut him down with one technique. You can even learn to cast that one without hand seals, so even if you're already in a sand coffin you can turn the tables on him and not only survive, but defeat him as well, as if you turn enough of his stuff into mud he can't even muster that automatic sand shield. Temari stood there staring in shock at him for a moment, before the wind mistress glommed onto him with all of the power her body possessed. Here. The single worst nightmare of her entire life, the constant nagging fear, approaching certainty, that one day the person Gaara killed when he lost his temper was going to be her, and he just shut that down. Naruto could teach her how to defeat Gaara, even if she was already in a sand coffin? Okay, that was it. She was having his babies. The girl began to weep tears of joy and relief. Naruto, the Hokage, folded his hands upon his desk. I'm sure you know why you're here. Yes. The boy nodded firmly. You've finally decided to listen to my reports that the Ninja Academy training was completely skewed and inadequate. The old man seemed nonplussed for a moment. Not quite, he said with a sad sort of smile. You're removing Kakashi as the leader of Team 7? The boy asked. No, Sarutobi firmly replied. You want to discuss my findings on the subject of earthworms? The boy stated with some authority. Why? The Hokage demanded, losing patience with the kid. Did you carve your own face onto the Hokage monument? Along with, let me see, the old guy shuffled some papers. The report he wanted was right on the top. A number of girls, ranging from a food stand waitress to a foreign kunoichi, and at least 2 of Konoha's clan heiresses? Well, I wanted to get them something special, and diamonds are just so overdone, the boy stated with a careless shrug. Yes. Yes. Jiraiya screamed, rolling about on his back. Just like that. What are you doing? Ino came close to ask Naruto, who had been watching this scene with some amount of clinical detachment. The boy turned a megawatt grin on her. You know how I've been delaying doing too much training under this guy, because it made me feel awful to do all of that vamping as a girl? She nodded, then motioned toward the insensate Sannin covered in his own drool. So, what's that got to do with this? The boy gave her a happy shrug. Well, you see, I was wondering why those illusion techniques were demonic this and demonic that, and it gave me another idea. So I'm trying it out on the old fart. More. More. The Sannin screamed, lost in his own world. Ino turned a curious gaze back toward her husband. He doesn't sound like you've got him in a demonic anything. That's exactly my point. Naruto returned to her brightly. I was wondering why those illusions were all demonic, so I created one that wasn't. The toad Sannin let out a long moan and passed out, unconscious and still covered in drool. So, Ino smacked her lips in curiosity. What was he seeing? An illusion where he was watching a hot spring of about 72 young girls, and they invited him to join them. A kind of a cross between a harem technique, a normal illusion, and his own fantasies. He filled in most of the details out of his own subconscious, just like most of those fear-activated illusions draw on stuff they've tapped from deep underneath the conscious mind. I used the same thing here. That way I don't have to be privy to what he likes. Naruto nodded seriously. Ino considered that solemnly for a moment. Okay, that sounded fair. So, do you think he'll train you now? Naruto snorted. Train me? He'd gladly commit suicide for me. That was his 3rd time under the technique. Sasuke Uchiha. I challenge you. I will prove that hard work is better than being a genius. Sasuke turned to face Lee in his typical I don't care about anyone else pose that might also be interpreted as don't bother me. I'm taking a crap in my pants look so often seen on young toddlers. However, instead of his usual arrogant reply, the Uchiha's features contorted briefly, and he lifted both hands to sink his index fingers 2 knuckles deep in both nostrils simultaneously before replying, Not now. I did a boo-boo, and I don't have time to clean up and fight you before the test. We will have our contest after, if that is all right with you? Staring in shocked disbelief at the yellow wet spot forming on the front of the Uchiha's shorts, along with the trails of moisture going down both legs, Lee could only nod in amazed disgust. Sakura had her very first I can't believe he did that. That's disgusting moment concerning the Uchiha, and could barely believe her eyes. The large crowd of fangirls drawn there by other girls dropping hints that a big fight starring the Uchiha was going to happen had thoughts along a very similar vein. Most there began to revise those thoughts of having a happy life with him. Ino carefully steadied Naruto's body so no one would notice that he wasn't in it just then. Kakashi, or someone who looked exactly like him, arrived to usher everyone off to the test without any further delays. So when the Uchiha came back to himself, he was already inside the center with people shoving disgusted and disapproving looks his way, and no way to escape those without failing. He turned to leave anyway, but a voice he couldn't identify sounded in his ear. In your shorts are 3 explosive notes, primed to detonate the moment you leave this chamber. He thrust a hand down quick and found one of them. Then he noticed the looks of all of the class on him and desisted his search for the rest until he could sit down and try to conceal those motions. Ino, in on the joke but acting out her part beautifully, sidled up to Sakura just as the Uchiha realized he'd shoved a hand inside of his pants with the whole room watching, and she said, "You know what? I don't want to be your rival anymore. You can have him." "Yeah, you can count me out too," Tenten openly agreed with her. "I mean, there's bloodline status, but there's also potty training." Sakura was mortified. "No! I do not want to play with your little brown friend," Naruto shouted aloud to the whole audience, after Sasuke had seemingly whispered a request to him. "What kind of sick bastard are you, man?" Then he laid out the Uchiha with one strong punch, a right hook, as it were, and shouted down at the unconscious body, "Don't ever ask me that again. Don't you remember? I told you, that's what you've got Sakura for." All eyes turned to the pink-haired Kunoichi, who shrank in on herself in mortal fear of their reactions, and almost ready to cry that she'd wasted so much time on the Uchiha or that he and Naruto both thought so poorly of her. Of course, Sasuke had asked nothing of the kind. But that wasn't what was important. What got everyone's attention was the reply Naruto had shouted, and that's what they'd recall of that conversation. "All right, settle down." Ibiki entered the examination room. Moments later, the head or torture and interrogation found he was looking up at the next in the line of Genin out to receive the tokens assigning them to their random seats, and found he was staring at the Uchiha, held up between 2 orange-clad shadow clones with clothespins over their noses. The prestigious bloodline carrier was unconscious and had evidently soiled himself quite badly. "Never mind," one of the clones shouted loudly. "Such is the power of the Sharingan that even out cold and covered in his own bodily wastes, Sasuke cannot fail this Chunin test." They had retrieved the Uchiha's token and taken him to his seat before the Jonin's stunned mental process restarted themselves, and by then it would be a trifle late to object, seeing as how the clones had deposited the heir to Konoha's most prestigious clan in his chair, head down on his desk, and struck themselves, vanishing in poofs of smoke. Objecting now would require moving the soiled child, and that would mean touching him and no. Not gonna happen. They had orderlies to look after that part of the torture and interrogation process, and he wasn't going to go back to those bad old days when he had that part of the job himself. Not over something so trivial. And ironically, as Ibiki reflected to himself, the boast made by those clones was right. The way Ibiki had this exam set up, the Uchiha could afford to sleep right through it, and would still pass because of the 10th question. He'd have to rethink that part of this exam. When the Uchiha woke up 20 minutes later and began to make carefully hidden motions, the head examiner had had enough, and Ibiki called out loudly, "Sasuke Uchiha, while it is not strictly cheating, 2 points off for wanking during class. Now get your hands out of your shorts and do the test." A moment later he added, "Oh, and I don't want that pencil back when you're finished with it." A further moment of thought provoked another addendum. "You can expect me to send you the cleaning bill for the chair and the floor, as well." So many people, including the proctors, were sniggering over this exchange that the stress levels never got so high, and they had record numbers pass. "Why did you do that, Sasuke?" a random fangirl desperately demanded as they concluded the test successfully, asking for him to say something, anything, to set her doubts to rest. Although what that could be, it would have to be a doozy. The Uchiha's features underwent a brief contortion, before Sasuke replied, "My parents told me that an Uchiha has to play with his poo in order to activate the highest levels of our bloodline." Unfortunately for the reputation of the Uchiha clan in general, he'd said this in a very loud voice in what was still a very crowded room. And, as Sasuke regained control of himself, it wasn't as if he could actually deny that statement. As to retract it, he'd have to give some version of the truth, and saying you had to kill your best friend wouldn't be any better received than that previous statement was. "Hey dork!" Temari called out from across the room, secretly hiding her glee over what her husband had arranged to happen. "They're called clan secrets for a reason. We don't want to know what you weirdos at Konoha do behind closed doors." Suddenly all of the other genins from Konoha realized that to support the Uchiha in this case meant they would be joining the image now being formed by the other villages that they were all closet deviants, and did their best to start protesting that image, distancing themselves from the Uchiha at once. All but the most devoted fangirls began to dump Sasuke like rats out of a sinking ship, and most of those took care to tell Sakura that she'd won, when all the girl wanted to do at that point was to deny her relationship to him herself. But instead, she got left holding the bag. Someone had to bear the next generation of Uchihas. And it looked like she'd been elected by the female population of her village. The girl wanted to cry when the third former rival in a row gave her a good luck with the potty training as she bowed out of the fight to leave it all to Sakura. Yeah, good thing for you you're already acquainted with his habits, the last of the fangirls told her before leaving her alone with the responsibility. Sakura broke down crying on the spot. Lee was almost apologetic when a newly washed Sasuke stormed up to him after the written test. Off in the background, Sakura was crying, inconsolable. She'd only wanted him because everyone else did. She'd wanted to prove she was better than all those girls who'd teased her by getting the guy they all wanted. It wasn't fair to leave her to him when they didn't want him anymore. For Lee, any fight against the Uchiha would be pointless. The bloodline heir had already proved, beyond any doubt, that hard work was superior to being an Uchiha. No one in Konoha could doubt that now. Fighting him would be pointless. So, when Sasuke challenged him, Lee sadly shook his head and declined. No need to degrade the Uchiha further. He was already defeated. Bruises would only add to that, reinforcing the fall of a formerly great clan. Although how anybody had respected them when they had such habits. Sasuke was left, fists shaking in despair and rage, as Lee simply turned his back and departed, leaving him without a target to vent his emotions on. And his Sharingan was no help to him in getting out of this situation. Sasuke was not good at talking his way out of anything as the last Uchiha, he never needed to. All of the respect granted to him and his clan had washed away most minor stuff like a cleansing wave. For the longest time, he could do no wrong at all in the eyes of the village. Now he was a public embarrassment. Other villages were whispering about Konoha and the strange sort of deviance they had there, and it was all due to that same last Uchiha. A clan that had once brought them major respect and envy was now just as major a disgrace. They couldn't even point to any huge success to offset the embarrassment he'd brought them. Not even his strongest supporters could point out any major accomplishments to date by their Uchiha. He'd gone on only one C-rank mission, and even by the highly flattering report of his instructor, he hadn't done very much. Thinking that was an oversight, they sought out Kakashi and pressed him for details, and what those eager supporters of the Uchiha discovered was that the copycat ninja had grossly inflated all of the parts during which he praised Sasuke during his reports. Sasuke had nearly committed suicide out of terror during his first fight of more than 2 seconds in length. He'd thrown one shuriken during that entire battle as his sole contribution, and that was at the instigation of one of his teammates. Then he'd gotten beaten up on the bridge by a person who wasn't even a real ninja, just trained as a servant by a missing one. There was nothing to be proud of in that lackluster performance. As his supporters failed to find evidence for their belief in his greatness, their numbers began to dwindle, and those who remained grew less vocal as the rest of the town soured on Sasuke Uchiha. It was not a change that Sasuke was prepared for. Nor was Sasuke equipped to deal with it. His silent reject everyone as beneath me routine was not well suited to winning over their affections once those had already been lost. Simply put, as the Uchiha, he never needed to talk his way out of trouble or convince people of anything, so he plainly lacked those skills now, and it was a lack that cost him dearly. It was not until that moment that he had any inkling at all how pathetic were his people's skills. But you never try to win friends and influence people, and you discover when you need to that you simply aren't good at it. The Uchiha found that he had no ability at all to change their opinions once they began to decide that he was not worth their veneration. Into this gap, Naruto stepped, getting Kurenai to approach the Hokage, with him there waiting as a stack of paperwork, following along that line that got Kakashi fired as Team 7's instructor, and the boy's secret parentage revealed. Ino had actually suggested that, as the way she explained it, nature abhorred a vacuum, and so with the loss of someone to respect, the townsfolk would fill someone to fill that slot. It might as well be the revealed son of the 4th Hokage as anyone. with the loss of their preconceptions that the Uchiha were all priceless treasures to be cherished, and that Sasuke was some jewel of rare and infinite price to be nurtured and protected, the people of Konoha were well prepared to have another of their long-held notions reversed. In an odd kind of symmetry, the town simply gave each one the label they'd once attached to the other. There was the valuable one to be encouraged and treated favorably, even given deals on goods bought at shops and things. Then there was the pariah, the one to be despised, hated and overcharged for everything, while given secret, or not so secret, glares and sneers. Neither boy was well prepared to step into the social role of the other. For Naruto, it was scary as anything for the villagers to be nice to him. But for the Uchiha, it was an entirely different world to live in where he could not just demand his way and get it. Fortunately for Naruto, his girls would not permit him to avoid all of the villagers this time, insisting that he get used to it, as this was the way they would rather be treated, and as his wives, how he got treated had a big effect on how everyone treated them, as well. So, like a man touching his toe into cold water, the boy began to slide carefully, hesitantly, and only a bit at a time into this new situation. It would be good for him, but it was the hardest acclimation he'd ever done. And it would take some while before he'd stop spooking when an ordinary villager called out to him a cheerful greeting. Still, he'd want to be taking that in measured doses. "Hi. Tsunade, right?" The cheerful blonde boy called up to the stacked blonde woman who was seated at the gaming table of a casino in the strip she was currently frequenting. "It took me forever to get Jiraiya to tell me where to find you." "Get lost, kid," the slug Sannin brushed him aside. Naruto frowned. "Wow. Would you look at that kid? He's cleaning the house out." Tsunade grabbed her apprentice to point to a blonde child she'd never seen before winning big at one of the tables. "Come on. Let's get in on some of that luck." "But," Shizen protested before being dragged along unwillingly by her teacher's insane strength. "Your steak, madam?" the croupier asked her as the legendary medic gave herself a seat at the table. Realizing the size of the wagers being laid on that green felt surface, the granddaughter of the first Hokage was about to bow out, but the boy stopped her with a simple statement. "She is welcome." The child looked up to her and met her eyes with a knowing grin. "You see, I am here trying to earn money for a transplant operation. A couple in my clan are getting married, and there is a bloodline that will have to be shared. You may write out a certificate worth the price of such an operation, if you will agree ahead of time to perform it if you fail to secure your note before the end of tonight's gambling." Adopting her best cunning grin, the legendary medic told him, "You're on," before making out such a paper, and cashing it in for chips. The trouble with that, as she found, was that the blonde kid never lost. After getting cleaned out of her first stake, the child again gave her a smile. "Oh, don't get up yet. Let us make another wager, just between us. I'll give you 1 month. If, during that time, you can manage to teach me to perform that bloodline transfer operation myself, for I am something of a medic ninja already, you see, then you'd get all of the winnings I collected tonight, including your redeemed certificate so you don't have to do the operation yourself." "And if you're too much of a lump to learn it?" she inquired sourly, already suspecting some trap. The boy suddenly looked at a loss, before shrugging helplessly and spreading his hands wide. "I've never failed to learn anything anyone has taught me." "Then why the wager?" Shizen butted in, relieved to be seeing some possibility for money in her and her teacher's future. "To convince her to try hard," the boy admitted honestly. "If she failed to teach me, then she wouldn't try very hard to do so, would she?" Both Tsunade and Shizen looked at each other, thoughts of no obvious on their faces. "So what happens if she loses?" Shizen rebutted a final time, wanting to clarify so they could avoid anything too bad. Naruto thought about it for a second before he shrugged, stretching his fingers and boldly declaring, "Then I stop giving you 2 massages." Shizen covered her head with her pillow to shut out the noise. Honestly, did her teacher have to shout out marriage proposals so loud? Of course, the next morning, she had to admit that she'd never seen her teacher try so hard at anything as she did at trying to teach that little blonde kid the bloodline transfer technique. That secretly made her curious about those massages herself. Tsunade rolled over and got out of bed. Maybe if she were drunk she wouldn't be kept up by her apprentice shrieking out marriage proposals at the top of her lungs. It wouldn't be so bad if only she had to wait her own turn. The legendary slug Sannin then nearly fell to her knees and thanked God for listening to her when the blonde kid's clone appeared at her door with a bottle of massage oil in his hands and a towel over one arm. They were only a day or so into his medical training, and Naruto was quickly finding out Tsunade was even more dangerous than Enko when it came to him and massages. I'm sorry, Naruto calmly refused Tsunade's latest request. But there are certain things I won't do for just anyone, and what you've asked is something I hold as reserved. Only my wives get to enjoy it. The boy found himself in a freakishly strong headlock standing before an altar with a terrorized priest on the other side of it before he even knew what was happening. He'd unfortunately used the plural form of wife, and she'd caught on to that. She didn't get to be a legendary ninja for nothing. Although where she got a wedding dress on such short notice astounded even him. Shizen stood grinning confusedly beside them, and he couldn't tell if what she had on was a really nice bridesmaid's gown, or another wedding dress. Nice bouquet she had in her hands, however. He was enough of a florist by now to appreciate that. His mind only kicked back into gear when he heard the priest say, out of the high-pitched squeak he forced out through his throat constricted by the hand presently around it, "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The wait grew uncomfortably long. What happens if I say no?" the blonde asked through his headlock. Dang. She'd even found some way to shut down his ninja techniques. Tsunade bent lower to whisper, sweetly threatening, in his ear. "Bad things. You don't want to go there." The boy sweated, hesitating. "Can I think about it?" "No." Tsunade spoke firmly, eyelid twitching, already gritting her teeth. "I have to go ask my other wives what they think first." The Naruto clone struck himself in the leg and vanished. After having completely destroyed the Uchiha's reputation, the Forest of Death was not quite the same experience it had been. For one thing, Sakura was far from the Uchiha-obsessed fangirl and did more than squeal and let her crush do all of the work for her. She seemed to realize that being dependent on Sasuke made it only more unavoidable for her to be linked to him in other ways. Not too long ago, that was exactly what she'd wanted. Now, with a murmur about potty training, she would set about her own tasks instead of playing damsel in distress for Sasuke to come bail her out of. Naruto wasn't expecting to have time to notice this, as there was the typical daily fight against Orochimaru scheduled for that first morning, which pretty much made all other considerations moot. But strangely, that didn't seem to happen either. Maybe he was less interested in the scatological wonder? They hadn't been aiming for a Gaara morning. For one thing, those were more difficult to do now that Tenten was keeping her memories, as she did not have the same experience or ability at acting that Naruto had developed, and so was going through that phase where things no longer surprised her, so she couldn't just go with a natural reaction because those had worn out of her long ago, but neither could she manufacture a convincing fake one. So it was hard for her to get the news about Gaara spread throughout Konoha quite so effectively as to reach and warn Sasuke. Sasuke was no longer at the center of news hubs anymore either. So, with him out of the loop, so to speak, it would have been even harder to get to him that information about Gaara being unbeatable, information that had always before convinced him to go try to beat him. It had been an ultimately unsatisfying reset for Naruto, who'd been wanting to do more study about the subject of that curse seal, and had been kind of eager for Orochimaru to deliver it so he could get on with his studies of it. The second disappointment had been that he'd been expecting to face Sasuke in the prelims, since this was a get Kakashi fired reset, and thus the Jonin would do some board manipulation to get them to face each other. And well, Naruto had some anti-Sharingan measures he'd wanted to try out. Instead, he got to see Sasuke sticking 1,000 birds technique through Lee's chest, killing the hard worker instantly. That had been surprising, as Sasuke hadn't known the 1,000 birds on any other repeat. So someone had to have taught him, and the only person who knew it should have been Kakashi, and there really ought to have been no time for them to be alone together, since they'd been in the forest and all. Up on the balcony, Hana's eyes had narrowed in understanding. Already a Chunin herself, she'd been there to cheer on Naruto, and of course her younger brother. Even if they fought each other, it did Kiba good to lose to her husband, especially as gentle and complimentary as Naruto was as he did it. But it also eased her mate's reception by the Inuzuka clan enormously to have that bond between the two develop, as it did when Kiba saw how enormously strong her husband was. But now her thoughts were launched down a different course. Only Kakashi could have or would have taught Sasuke that technique. And Team 7 had been in the forest, where there shouldn't have been any opportunities for the lazy instructor to train the arrogant bastard. Oh yes, it had not taken her many repeats to learn to use her mate's terms for those two ninja. Obviously, Kakashi was willing to cheat the rules when he cared to, as there was no other explanation than that the Jonin had slipped into the forest and taught him while the test was going on. Naruto had thought Sasuke was just doing more brooding than usual when he'd slipped into his tent and wouldn't come out for hours on end. More brooding had kind of been expected. But no, it was fairly obvious now what they'd done. The Uchiha had gone into his tent to get out of sight, where Kakashi would have met him to body flicker them both off, since Sasuke didn't know that technique, to someplace private to train, then back again once they were finished. Kakashi was an elite Jonin, or had been one at any rate before he'd let his skills start to degrade through laziness. It would have been easy enough for him to have slipped past any guards on the test. Heck, this was Konoha. He could have waltzed right past those guards openly, and they would have thought he was there on legitimate business. As heiress to one of the powerful clans, Hana knew from personal exposure that Konoha trusted those they loved, and Kakashi had been one of those, a genius prodigy from a distinguished family, and for many years carrier of their most beloved bloodline, as well. All things members of this village adored. He could get away with breaking a few rules, and apparently had done so in order to train Sasuke in his most secret technique. Although, from the look of surprise on the Jonin's face when the match was called, he hadn't wanted Lee to be the other participant in that fight. It made sense, as the Jonin had no grudge against the green-clad boy that she knew of, they were all against her husband. So, the copycat had trained up Sasuke to get revenge on him, but the Uchiha had ended up facing Lee in the preliminaries instead. So, once again, the question became who'd manipulated the board this time? And for that, it was pretty obvious. Couldn't have been the Hokage, as the Jonin's efforts had always slipped by the old man before. So, that left whoever it was that was the unknown third party Naruto had told her of. One thing she had realized and had to love about resets, seeing things go one way, and knowing they'd always do so again unless changed, eliminated most of the guesswork out of trying to find explanations behind things. Hey Sasuke! Naruto shouted down from the balcony beside her, just as Sasuke was finished offing Lee. You can kill someone, but that doesn't stop you from being a Pufanda. The Uchiha glowered angrily at him. You don't spend time investigating an enemy you aren't going to engage, Hana told her new pack as she thought of her husband and his other wives. Well, we already knew that. Didn't we? I mean, how many invasions have we lived through so far? Ino quipped from where she was lying around, waiting for Naruto, who entered with Temari. The sand kunoichi and he had already been talking. What you did with Sasuke is called a character assassination, or the trade term among us ninja is more often a social assassination. They're harder to do than simply slipping a knife in between someone's ribs, but also can be far more devastating. The Wind Mistress shrugged, feeling chatty. That you got away with one is really amazing, as ninja are supposed to be more on their guard against that sort of thing, but you fooled a whole village. A big part of that is that Sasuke didn't defend himself, thinking he was above that, Naruto declared, using the authority of experience as his guide. Hana bluntly interrupted this conversation. Naruto. We must get more information on our enemies. Next reset, why don't you use the clan nose to get Orochimaru's scent during one of those fights in the Forest of Death? Her husband rubbed his nose. Why? I already know he's there, don't I? The Inuzuka clan heiress smiled for him. It was a sly one. You don't have the same experience with our clan techniques as I do, or you'd already know. Once you know his scent pattern, then you can show us to a spot where he's left it. After that, we can use that to track him all over town. Okay, he's been here, he's been there, and he interacted with these people. The sort of information that tells us who he has working for him, where he goes and what he does in a way that lets us memorize his entire route through town. She got treated to several looks of shocked understanding. That's awesome! Ino twittered out in glee. Hana tried not to brag as she preened, just a bit, under the attention. I asked this because I think he's been there, at the Chunin preliminaries. He might be our unknown third party who's been manipulating that board. Even more shocked understanding. It felt good to be an alpha. The boy scratched his head, thinking, but my tail. That thing when I can find all of you. That's a scent marker. Those are physical things. Those don't pass a reset. But a scent pattern, Hana chuckled. That's like knowing someone's face. You get one of those, and you always remember it. Naruto, you ought to know that by now. Naruto nodded, suddenly businesslike. Okay. Now I want everyone's opinions. Tsunade, the slug Sannin, wants to get married to me. Votes? Instant strong reactions from all sides. Most of them powerfully good. Tenten surged up off of her pillow. Could you get her to join us during the resets? Having thought about it, Naruto nodded. I think so. Hana was shocked. Having a legendary Sannin join this pack? Okay, maybe it would be good to step back from being the alpha female. She nodded fairly. That's some serious firepower you're talking about adding. We need it. Let's do it. Hinata pushed her fingers together. Thoughts, my first and beloved? Naruto joined her in a hug from behind. Naruto-kun? Hinata ventured to ask her husband. Can we add my teacher to this? I miss her. Kurenai-sensei has been the closest thing I've had to a mother since my own died, and I miss being able to talk with her. I think all of us girls could really use her advice, and she is older. She was clearly running out of reasons when Naruto stopped her, putting his hands over hers so she couldn't push her fingers together. Hey! Don't need to convince me. You had my agreement when you said you missed her. The shy heiress met his kind eyes, saw the sincerity there, and melted. I'd like there to be a couple of conditions. Temari considered this aloud. First, we all get her to train us in everything she knows. That goes for both the slug Sannin and Hinata's teacher. If we're all going to be a family, then it's only right and fair for that to happen. Plus, Naruto, you've picked up your own training in those areas in such a spotty manner that it's hard for you to train us in medicine or illusions, and we need those. We're a family, and it's going to be important that none of us die, even after the resets, so medical skills are an absolute must. Hana was nodding. Lots of human medical techniques can be adapted to use on animals, too. Our clan beasts will be stronger for it. About that, Naruto interrupted with his own idea. We've got several years before that latest litter of puppies are useful to us as combat familiars. The rest of the clan dogs are already assigned, Hana interrupted, frowning, but quieted submissively when Naruto overruled her. No, that's not what I'm thinking at all, the boy said with a very wide grin. I know they are, but had another suggestion in mind. We need adult combat companions, right? Several nods all around from girls who had been excited to be introduced to the coveted Inuzuka family techniques, and a bit disappointed that they couldn't use some of the best of them to fight off the upcoming invasion. Naruto sat down so one of him was cuddling each of his wives, having to stop Ayam from serving them all cookies to get her included, too. So, what does everyone think about clan tigers? I know some really good ones out in the Forest of Death. We've run into them more than a few times during the test. They're big enough to ride on comfortably, and already great fighters. Hana thought about it for a moment. It's harder to train adults, but it can happen. We don't know any training techniques for tigers. All of ours are rather specific to dogs, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't learn or develop new ones. We've got the time to fully explore more techniques. And we can use Naruto's time dilation illusion, useful for cramming 3 days into 1 second, to have the time we need to train the tigers to get used to us despite the resets. Temari finished for them all excitedly. After sucking on that thought a moment, Hana had to agree. That could work. But I'm still not giving up my dogs. No one's asking you to, Ino reassured her. We just need adult fighting pets for the rest of us. She'd never told Naruto how narrowly her team squeaked by to get to the prelims, but she'd become almost desperate for more combat capacity, over and above what he was already teaching them. Naruto, he could learn to help them get along together, couldn't he? Hinata shyly asked. None of the girls could disagree, and say that was impossible. So what if cats and dogs were famous for fighting? He'd already done how many things they all would have thought impossible. Hana was nodding. As a vet, I've seen plenty of farm animals, and farmers have no problems keeping cats and dogs at the same time. As work animals they get along just fine, or well enough at any rate. And you gotta admit, Tenten interjected smoothly, with a big grin on her features. It would fit the cat motif Naruto's already got on our ninja garb. Ino could hardly have been more pleased at all of the special training she was getting from her husband, and she liked that thought, her husband. Even if she did have to share him, it hardly felt like that most of the time, as he had so many clones all over the place. She'd had all of the privacy to be alone with him that she could want, both for training and just for talking, and this thing where the girls got together scratched her itch for female chatting as well. Really, it was as if she'd had this explosion of extra family members. And she'd always wanted a couple of sisters. However, trying to disguise everything was a bit awkward, and as she left that meeting where Naruto and the wives discussed plans for the future resets, and the general direction of their training and stuff in general, she saw her genin teammates, Shikamaru and Choji, obviously waiting for her outside of the building. Iam's family restaurant was the most convenient place for most of them to meet without going all of the way to the outskirts of town to train at the Uchiha properties. And any time Choji was waiting outside of a restaurant, rather than inside and eating, something major was up. And what that was pretty obvious to her by now. Shikamaru had started to suspect something. Training over the resets must have started to change her behavior, and from his perspective the blonde girl had changed overnight. "Hi guys." Ino stopped before the pair of them, raising her hand to wave a brief greeting, pretending nothing was wrong. "What's up?" "That's what we should be asking you," Shikamaru told her over folded arms, where he was leaned up against the side of the building. Lolling his head around to look at her more closely, he told her, "One night you had trouble talking without mentioning Sasuke, then you drop him like you never heard a less interesting subject. You never bring him up again. But there is no break up or fight to explain it." "Oh, go back to being lazy," she told him. "I'm too troublesome, remember? Go and watch some clouds, or something." Ino was about to go stomping off in disgust, but before she'd even realized it, she'd been caught in his shadow bind technique. The extra darkness had been disguised by their standing in the shadowed side of the building. So she was well and truly stuck, as Shikamaru went on speaking. The lazy genin was uncharacteristically alert as he went on speaking. "Unlike certain other teams, we at least pay attention to our teammates. One day you were a Sasuke-obsessed fangirl with among the worst skills of any ninja of Konoha. Yet overnight you become quite skilled and are holding secret meetings with other Konoha ninja who aren't acting the way they used to. Our instructor doesn't know what's happened to you, or where you got those abilities, or what those meetings are for. So there are some questions that have to be asked." Shikamaru stood up. "So we are going to march to where Asuma is waiting so he can start to ask them." Ino's mind was running furiously all the time they made their walk to where Asuma was waiting for them, her body under the control of her teammates' shadow bind technique, so she had no choice but to follow along as they walked there. Her face was flaming in helpless embarrassment by the time they got there. "Now Ino Asuma," her team's Jonin instructor began. "If that is who you really are," Shikamaru interjected. Asuma gave him a glance and the lazy boy shut up, going back to watching clouds while listening intently. Choji did what he'd been doing all this time, munching on potato chips while looking concerned. "Ino," Asuma resumed, speaking to her gently, but with concern. "You have been acting very differently since the start of the Chunin exam. We just have some questions about your new abilities." "Fine," she released the word with a sigh, wishing she could do other than copy Shikamaru's movements, because right now was the wrong time to be looking at clouds. "I joined a secret cult of Naruto worshippers who believe that he is the incarnation of the god of ramen, and we gather together for secret meetings where he can pour broth over us and slurp our hair." Choji choked on his chips and Shikamaru got so surprised that he accidentally released his technique, letting he get back control of her body again. Ino clobbered him a good one, then turned back to her teacher, hands on her hips, as she explained. "Naruto's got a new secret technique that he made up all by himself. I don't know how he did it, but he's got this thing where 2 or more people can get inside of his head and share ninja tricks together, but it all happens really fast. He needed me to help set it up, but we involved some other girls and we're all learning together. It's like a club. I'm picking up stuff from a weapons user named Tenten, a sand chick named Temari, and a few other kunoichi. We all share what we know, and we're all getting better fast. I knew I stank as a ninja, and this is really helping me out." "And what can you add to that? You had no skills worth trading." Shikamaru got up, rubbing his head where she had hit him. The blonde girl rolled her eyes. "Like I said, they couldn't even have started it without me. That sort of paid my entry fee right there." I don't understand. Choji paused in his munching of chips. You guys get inside of Naruto's mind for this? Ino went all glittery, unconcerned with the sudden, sharp interest of her teacher or Shikamaru. Oh, it's beautiful. You'd never guess the kind of wonderful things he has in there. Most minds are kind of boring, but he has this pool, and as she broke off, blushing and giggling. So is that why you dumped Sasuke? Shikamaru continued to rub away at the bump on his head. Jerked out of her pleasant memories to face something completely unrelated to her wonderful thoughts, it was all Ino could do to blink. Sasuke? Sasuke who? Asuma smiled, clapping a hand on Shikamaru's shoulder reassuringly. You see? It's just young girls being young girls after all, just as I told you. It's not unusual for them to change friends like socks at that age. Hey! Ino shouted, hands going down to form fists by her sides. Unbeknownst to her, not far away Tenten was having a serious discussion with Guy, after Lee and Niji had brought her before him. Once Shikamaru had pointed out that she'd been displaying skills no one knew she had before. Amazingly enough, they'd both been around Naruto enough by then that their excuses matched on all of the important details. So, what happened here? Looking up at the senior NBU, the two junior masked official ninja of Leaf drew to attention. Unknown at present. There were no witnesses of the event itself. Although, a baker reported seeing two individuals departing quickly from the scene. Description of what they were wearing matches the reported uniforms of the Akatsuki. The senior NBU looked down upon Sasuke's lifeless body, one whose eyes had been gouged out, and had suspicious brown stains around the mouth. So, Itachi got his revenge for Sasuke, revealing they were a secret clan of pool wielders already, Dang. I'm going to have to pay off my debt to Naoko. I bet it was going to take him another week. I obviously need more. Yes. That will fix everything. People shout about my errors because they stand out. I've only got a handful. That will change when I willingly introduce hundreds of them. Since this was a Get Kakashi Fired reset, Naruto didn't have to wait for an opportunity to approach Kurenai, as she was already his teacher. Currently her eyes were wide and her jaw hanging open as she regarded the insensate Toad Sannin, who was covered in his own drool. And she'd watched that happen. Once she'd recovered herself a bit from the amazement and cleared her throat, she said, "Brilliant use of illusions, Naruto. Ninja are trained to be resistant to fear, but they aren't trained to resist pleasure, so they really would find this more difficult to fight against. And its use as a bribe is really outstanding. Would he really give you a summoning scroll if you asked?" Those were among the most precious and well-guarded of techniques. Naruto's only answer was to grin and summon a toad as big as a horse to sit on. The Jonin's eyes widened yet further. So he has. The blonde boy was giddy. We're also using pleasure/pain illusions to help train our clan tigers, to reward or punish behavior respectively. It works until we have better methods worked out. Clan tigers? She blinked at him several times. Naruto popped to his feet, eager to tell her, "Oh yeah. They've got ones as big as horses over at the Forest of Death. They're better fighters than most Chunin, and would probably be that great if they could use jutsu. So, we're training them. Did you know that Konoha tigers happen to be a social animal? They hunt in groups, like lions." Hana is really impressed. She says that will make everything a lot easier. What easier? The Jonin was, admittedly, having a touch of trouble following all of his thoughts. He was introducing new concepts so quickly. Naruto sighed, slowing down the pace of his explanations. Hana Inuzuka has joined a small study group I've formed. We're all agreed to share all of our techniques, and in return for a bunch of secret wind techniques and weapon use and a whole bunch of other stuff, as her contribution Hana is sharing her clan's beast techniques. That's against the law. Kurenai began sputtering. Clan techniques are perfectly acceptable for sharing among spouses. Think of it as a harem, if you will, but I've married a ton of girls, and as part of my new family we are acting to strengthen each other's techniques and fighting styles, and that includes sharing those restricted jutsu. That put Kurenai back, and she unintentionally blurted out her first thought, Hinata will be crushed. Why? Naruto returned, honestly puzzled. She was the first member of it, and would have been the only spouse I had if she hadn't gone and recruited a second all by herself, just to boost her own confidence in her ability to handle me. That opened up room for a third to volunteer, and a handful have decided since then that this arrangement suited them. Yes. He might have encouraged such decisions on their behalves, such as by administering the odd massage or creating an outfit or two. Still, those decisions had all been theirs. He just provided input to help those decisions along. That's all. The boy put his arms behind his head and casually examined the sky. In fact, Hinata made me promise to offer you a chance to come down and check in on all of us, sort of be our den mother. The girls wanted to have an older woman to confide in, and you could make sure that nothing inappropriate was going on at the same time. That is, if you wanted to. Inappropriate? The Jonin blinked. The kid had a harem. The whole thing was inappropriate. Well, technically legal, she supposed, suddenly recalling the various bloodline protection laws in place, put in there by Konoha's major bloodline-carrying clans and bolstered by some others for fast recovery in cases of catastrophe, as nobody could be sure that what happened to the Uchiha could only ever happen just the once, or that a sudden loss during a war might not do effectively the same thing to an unlucky family, but still. Shoving those scattered thoughts aside for the moment, the illusion mistress firmed up her resolve and nodded. Yes, Naruto. I'd like to come down and see if anything inappropriate is happening. Your girls might need counseling, after all. Naruto grinned. Illusions could be used for torture. Kurenai knew this. She also knew, from having seen his demonstration, that they could be employed for pleasure as well. Once she'd had a second to think on it, it had become apparent to the Jonin that what Naruto could possibly be doing was something awfully similar to what he'd openly said they'd been doing to tigers, using pleasure or pain illusions to reward or punish behavior, brainwashing those girls that way. It didn't add up with what she'd seen of the kid's character, or what Kakashi said about him. But she was enough of a ninja not to discount the possibility. After having made the short trip to a ramen stand, then up the steps in the back of the store to the modest home above it, when Naruto explained they had been having most of their meetings, she had to admit that this was looking less and less like a typical cult all of the time. For one thing, Naruto just didn't have that greasy preacher feeling of a cult leader. Secondly, successful brainwashers are in control, it's a requirement, and from the number of requests, catcalls, ordinary conversation bits and other things to which he just replied yes, dear, in a humble tone as he was asked to deliver hairspray, or a massage, or to go get groceries, this was a fairly normal human relationship despite its odd angles. That made Kurenai very curious indeed, as she was also enough of a ninja to look beneath the surface and to be able to discard wrong data, and her first thought of a brainwashing cult just didn't bear up under the barest scrutiny of the evidence. In fact, it felt like she just walked into the home of a comfortable, well-adjusted, normal by ninja standards anyway, family. Which should have been impossible, since he'd only known most of these girls for a couple of weeks. But then again, the female Jonin had to sigh and revise her beliefs yet again in favor of the evidence. People just did not act that comfortable around each other without lots of practice. Seeing Ino, who was among the most status-conscious young genin girls in town, lying down with her hair in a towel, just fresh from a bath, no makeup and only wearing a bathrobe, as one of Naruto's clones rubbed her feet and ankles, that sort of cozy domestic scene was very typical for husbands and wives, but not for blushing teenagers or girlfriends out to impress a person. It was a I've seen you at your worst and love you anyway scene of domestic love and bliss. That sort of harmony didn't come out of nowhere, and often didn't exist at all, even among older established married couples of many years. It showed a genuine bond of a sort that couldn't be faked, well, not well enough to fool her, at any rate. She hadn't gotten her Jonin rank out of nowhere, after all. Kurenai began, only in that moment, to believe those girls might actually love the guy and not have married the village pariah out of some sort of duress like enslavement or brainwashing. No jutsu she knew of could evoke feelings of love and kindness, and Naruto was positively oozing joy over the privilege of rubbing Ino's feet. Kurenai had once heard love described as a feeling you get where it is a privilege to hold your wife's hair out of her face so it doesn't get in the way as she barfs in the toilet. She'd never actually seen that happen before, but this Naruto, she could believe it. He truly loved them that much, and would be happy, ecstatic even, to do exactly that. It was a sort of tenderness, mixed with devotion, and a dash of good, solid affection, although that didn't half describe it adequately. He cherished those girls. And it didn't go only the one way either. She could tell that each and every one of those girls would find themselves hopping up out of the skylights in glee over having morning sickness, as it would be a sign they'd have his child. She shook herself out of that imagery, as there was nothing there to suggest that any of those girls had entered into a state of pregnancy. But it was a compelling image all the same. Those girls would gladly suffer discomfort, bloating, and a whole range of other difficulties to make that boy happy, and the thing was that went the other way just as far, with him being honored to fetch and carry for them, treating each girl as if she was her own precious princess to him. Each one a jewel incomparable to the others. It honestly made Kurenai a little envious. Asuma was, at best, an indifferent suitor. But he'd shown out when contrasted to the rest of her admittedly small group of admirers. And she had to quash a jealous feeling, the urge to punish someone else for being happier than she had any hope of being. It was a momentary thing, and not all that strong, but it still surprised her. She'd thought herself above all that. Only, in that moment, she wasn't an instructor concerned about her shy and delicate student, or a jonin worried over possible illegal activities, but a cave woman who felt envious over another female having gotten a better catch, and about to reach for her club to try and take it from her, if only just to destroy it so her rival couldn't have it. That thought was very unlike her, and she admonished herself sternly over it, all inside of her head. And in that moment, she had to acknowledge that what she'd been feeling was real, as that type of deep, gut reaction only came when deep down you knew that what you were seeing was real, and you'd never have the luck be so happy yourself. The illusion mistress heaved a deep sigh, resolving to go out and seek Anko. It was time the two of them got drunk again. Usually it was the other woman who came after some disappointment or other and needed the companionship of a good friend as she went out and got plastered. This evening, it would be the other way around, with Kurenai doing the same thing, only as the active one out to drag the other instead of a semi-resisting participant going along out of friendly duty to be there with a shoulder to cry on her usual role. Dang it! She was too young to feel a spinster. But this happy scene of marital bliss before her made her feel twice her age, at least. No small part of that being due to the fact that she felt unable to match this happy picture on her own prospects. No, Anko would get dragged out drinking tonight. Not that the special jonin would object, it would just confuse her, and only until she'd gotten Kurenai to confess the whole thing after the red-eyed woman gotten herself smashed over it. Sometimes it really stank, being able to predict yourself so well. Temari was happy. She was married. Those two facts were connected. Oh, half the time they didn't bother telling the village anything, as over time it grew boring having too many weddings all on top of one another, something that, she supposed, set her apart from other women who thought that you simply could not have enough weddings sometimes. Well, they should try it. It got boring real fast, but still, she knew it and was willing to ride along, let the village think whatever it wanted to. Actually, the Sand Kunoichi had never seriously considered the prospect of marriage in her immediate future, as she was an outcast in her own village because of her relationship to Gaara. So casual dating, and even most friendships, had been impossible for her across most of her life. Thoughts of marriage had been like thoughts of, well, any other impossible dream. And no matter how fancy or nice the illusion, you still had to wake up and face reality. Well, it just so happened that now her reality included a husband. Circumstances were a bit odd, it was true, what with the harem thing and the being caught in a time loop. As they had it, however, they didn't have it so bad. Naruto was utterly devoted to them, just as much as they were to him. And none of them had to suffer any of the loneliness he'd had to, as they had each other to commiserate to and be social with. Naruto had actually confessed to her, at one point, that a big part of the reason why he'd let Hinata talk him into including more than one girl in this whole relationship, and the time loop that came with it, was that in his great girl decode, as he'd like to call it, he'd discovered that girls needed to talk. For her that was like pointing out that birds needed air to fly. But to him that had apparently been some great discovery, that girls actually needed to talk about their feelings and things. He'd compared it to hunger. It was just there and had to be dealt with, nor was it optional. Going without good conversations was bad for girls, even if they didn't talk about anything important. Realizing he'd had no sisters growing up, or no mother either for that matter, she could forgive him for not knowing something so obvious. But he didn't have to pretend like he just uncovered one of the secrets of the universe, or something. Still, it was awfully cute for him to try. So, he'd said, since girls had to talk, and those conversations couldn't afford to be unchanging. In order for any girls to be included, he'd had to include more than one, so they could talk about their issues during the whole time warp thing without going batty or having no one to understand them. Well, she had to admit, that was considerate of him. It certainly made it easier to accept everything, once taken in that light. Not that sharing him was any hardship, mind you. If anything, they felt that he outnumbered them. As, even with their shadow clones, they could only create about a dozen each at maximum, mostly just 3 or 4 to be safe, while he typically did thousands. It was enough to make her feel like he could marry every kunoichi in the village, and not only would it not cost her anything, it was possible she'd not even notice until it came time to be selecting babysitters. Oh? You're married to him too? I had no idea. Then dragged the other girl off into conversations. Temari felt almost embarrassingly hedonistic thinking of it that way. Then, in the very quiet depths deep inside her soul that she'd have to discuss with the others, she also admitted that she found his tale to be a major turn-on. Shying away from those embarrassing topics, she saw one of him enter with Kurenai beside him. Eager to be talking to an older, experienced woman about important issues like how it felt and what it meant to be turned on by one's husband's foxy bits, she rushed over to assist in the Jonin's assimilation into the group so such important topics could be broached in confidence. Hello? Have you seen Naruto's Mindscape training technique yet? She asked the older woman with a brilliant smile gracing her own face. It would only be one reset and the woman could be convinced of the truth of their story, and then such important secrets could be shared. Kurenai stared out across the village of Konoha, unburned, unblemished, and unable to believe her eyes. There. Over there. She'd seen a 6-tailed demon tiger appear. She'd known she had. It was unmistakable. No jutsu, no technique, no ninja had ever caused such feelings of helplessness and horror in her. It had been a bad reminder of just how much she'd forgotten about how terrified she'd been on the night of the Kyuubi attack. She was an illusion mistress. She knew how to fake things, and conversely, what could not be faked. And frankly, anyone able to create an illusion that real was even more of a danger than the 6-tailed tiger itself was. Luckily, it was known to be impossible even among the strongest illusionists. Then there had been the demon dragon as well. It had been mind-boggling. The whole town had burned, Konoha was reduced to ashes, and then those ashes pounded on relentlessly until there wasn't even a recognizable crater left. She'd been on the outskirts, among the few survivors, out there on a run for their lives and being chased by sand and sound ninja. And now there wasn't a thing to indicate it had ever happened. Even among ninja, whole villages don't get destroyed overnight, and then the next morning no one noticed a difference. Konoha had been destroyed, and now it wasn't. That merited a talk with the Hokage. She'd even dragged the boy who'd explained it all to her along so he could explain it all to him. That had gone fruitlessly. She'd pressed until they'd had to isolate Naruto for medical evaluation, withdrawing him from the Chunin exam so they could determine his mental state, and if the demon fox was escaping, even just to cause her nightmares. After having the boy committed to the psyche ward of Konoha's General Hospital, Naruto's girls had come, some alone, others in groups, to tell her how they felt about that. Hinata had actually been bold enough to scold her for having done that to poor Naruto, a boldness that made Kurenai wonder if she wasn't the one to go insane. But Ino and Tenten had formed an odd partnership, and simply taken buckets of smelly tar and brightly colored paint, splashing them all around her house. Kurenai had chased both laughing girls out, but the damage had been done. It would have been months to fix it and clean everything, but now it was a new morning. The paint and smelly tar were gone. Sarutobi had never heard her telling wild stories about the double demon attack or the destruction of Konoha. He'd never had Naruto committed to psyche evaluation on her recommendation. And what's more, he'd never listened to her explanations about Naruto's ability with illusions, or fired Kakashi, or given her permission to train the son of their previous Hokage. It was too big to be an illusion, too complex, and she'd done everything she could to test for one or dispel it anyway, not wanting to believe that what she'd been told was occurring. But it was anyway. It was all, exactly, every point, as the boy described it. Time was repeating, caught in a loop, everything resetting to the first day of the most recent set of Chunin exams. And only those who'd furnished bedrooms in his mind knew anything about it. She turned to face him, the red-eyed Jonin looking down at the much shorter boy's upturned face. He'd already, very obligingly, shown the village that he was bearing enough foxy accoutrements to freak out any average member of Konoha. Their reactions had been real, and far too complex or complete to have been orchestrated by one human mind. It was too large and detailed to be any kind of dream or illusion she knew of. And nobody at all remembered any of it the day after. Even Sakura, Naruto's teammate, had gone from a simpering, weak-willed fangirl one moment, to seeking Naruto, her foundation, for support against having to marry Sasuke, back to fangirl obsessed over marrying the Uchiha, then over to a scornful, sneering turncoat glad that demon brat had been contained, and now back to fangirl again. That alone was too complete a job to be faked. Girls may have mood swings, but that was ridiculous. Kurenai sighed, then nodded. All right. You've got me convinced. Time is caught inside of a loop. Why haven't you brought the Hokage in on this? The boy scowled in frustration at himself. I've tried, but the jutsu doesn't work on him for some reason. I'm exploring why, but for the present the child spread his hands to indicate how helpless he was. Hinata's teacher had to nod in understanding. Some things you could do, and others you couldn't. It was clear the boy had invented the technique himself, so could hardly be blamed for not knowing why it had certain limits. Some techniques had been in use for centuries, and still no one knew all of why they would do some things and yet not others. Sighing again, she blew out a big breath of contained air, and her frustrations with it. Okay, kid. You've got yourself a den mother. I'll look after your girls on all of their womanly issues, give them the advice they need, and assist you in training and planning, cover you with the other jonin, and so on. She sighed again, shaking her head as the enormity of the task faced her. Pity we don't have Anko in on this. She'd like to be facing Orochimaru over and over again. Naruto stood before Anko, grinning brightly. Then she smirked. Okay, kid, you've got my interest. Tell me what you know already. We'll see where we go from there. He began to list them off. My basic 3 are fully mastered, sealless and almost traceless. Body flicker and the traveling 10 likewise. I also know. A few moments later. Impulsively, Anko grabbed the kid's head and mashed his face into her bosom. She had a son. Boyfriend. Brother. Whatever you wanted to call it. Whatever he wanted to be. Train him? Heck. She'd gladly marry him. If this kid was this strong at 12 years old, just think of what he'd be at 15, or 20. Her old teacher was doomed. Did you hear her? Doomed. The special jonin broke out in mad, triumphal cackling, still crushing the kid's face into her underclad bosom, and giving him an eyeful in the bargain, and it was a significant step up from the equipment on his wives. Oh, boy, we are going to defeat Rochi-chan and make his life hell. Come here and give me a hug. She gave a long, joyful cackle. Still holding the kid's head to her chest, she whispered gleefully in his ear, Tell me, how do you like to know the temporary paralysis technique? Already know it, he responded into her fleshy pillows. Good for fighting snakes, as they are especially vulnerable to it, and it gets harder for Rochi to summon more, as he's first got to dismiss the inactive ones, costing him chakra he'd rather use on more summonings. Having thought she had already had the perfect student, Anko had to revise that one step higher. Say, she asked, after blinking several times, have you ever considered sex with an older woman? She was going to keep this one by hook or by crook, and that was one of the traditional ways women got men into their clutches. It had never worked out that way for her, but you never knew, and had to keep trying your options. Or so she thought anyway. Still, the moment after she'd said it, she'd started to doubt herself, as that was some awfully heavy guns to be hauling out, and he was probably too young a kid to even be considering that yet. Still, just as she was about to draw a breath to retract that question, she felt a pair of hands under her trenchcoat on her fleshy globes. Naruto had shifted his face, about to be staring up at her hour of her cleavage. Can I offer you a massage and let you think about it? Tsunade looked up at the official front gates of Konoha and sighed. Far from the only entrance, they remained the most symbolic one. Shizen, beside her, spoke reassuringly. Really, Tsunade? Bad thoughts now? Isn't this point a little late for that? The legendary medic mock snarled at her apprentice of many years. First name basis now, huh? Well, it only seemed appropriate, what with everything else and all. Legally, you and I are sisters, and were ever since we both said I do to the terrified priest in front of that young man you had in a headlock over the altar. The apprentice of many years giggled girlishly. Rolling her eyes, the legendary medic had to admit she had a point. Okay, sis. Now you tell me, what is an old crone like me doing with some young kid? The crone in question doubted herself, the relationship, pretty much everything after the 2 days of walking it had taken them to reach the town. Well, Shizen put a finger to her chin, pretending to think about it. I thought it had something to do with those massages. Instantly, before she had a chance to continue, her suddenly revitalized teacher had picked her up and dragged the much younger woman across the entranceway and past the gates of a town she had sworn never to return to. Yet, even as they entered, both could swear they overheard a cry of, "Now give me babies," in a woman's voice they didn't recognize. Shizen was smiling, even in her teacher's adamant grip. Brightly, she chirped. Well, now we know where to find him at least. Tsunade smiled, and chorused with her apprentice, "Follow those cries." Today is a day for deeds of greatness. Tsunade called out from atop the Hokage monument. Turning around, she addressed her army of fellow wives and their shadow clones. Are you ready? Yes. Came the responding roar of 50 throats raised in unison, chisels held aloft. A breeze gave the assembled girls' hair a stir. Forward! The granddaughter of the first shouted, pointing over the cliff. With a roar, they surged ahead, Tsunade in the lead, racing off the top of the mountain to run down the face of it, feet sticking to the side. In a rush, all of the other Hokage's faces got chiseled off only to be replaced by Naruto's grinning image at twice the former Hokage's size and his name carved out in loving detail below it, along with the caption Happy Chunin Day. Why? Sarutobi pled, after he'd pulled his face up out of his hands over the appalling nature of this stunt. Well, Tsunade drawled out casually. We've decided to celebrate Naruto's birthday for him today, and cakes are just overdone. Did you see that? He's going to come out from around the tree now. Even as Naruto said it, it happened, just as he described. Yes, I see it. Enko told him, holding her own set of binoculars on the far distant Orochimaru fight. You've got his reactions pretty well pegged. I ought to. I've been fighting him long enough, the blonde snorted, holding up a set of binoculars himself trained on the distant fight with Team 7. He's just toying with them, Shizen said, peering through her own pair, where they all waited on the vantage point. Hardly surprising. He is a legendary Sannin, Kurenai said from where she was posted nearby, also looking through optics train on the site. We're not invulnerable, Tsunade corrected. Look for weaknesses. He's got some, although fewer than I would have expected. Couldn't Jiraiya still take him? Enko adjusted her dial focusing knob just a tad as the fight moved farther away. He didn't succeed the last time I bribed him to. It was more of a stalemate, although that would be a good fight to watch again. Naruto spoke from his own place in the spotter's gallery overlooking the typical, everyday fight between Orochimaru and Team 7. You learn more about what he does when he's serious when Rochi-chan is feeling pressed. Like those stories you told us of those times when you turned the forest into a war zone? Shizen asked. Yeah, those. Naruto confirmed. Although I wouldn't recommend them. It got pretty ugly, and no safe vantage points to watch from, what with the smoke and the fire and everything. I'm not surprised, Kurenai muttered, seeing as how Enko was too caught up in observe the specific details of the fight they'd been watching to speak on her own just then. From what you describe, you have several thousand Chunin effectives your clones at the level you were then. Then you turned the entire forest into a trap, anticipated Orochimaru's every move, and still got beaten. It deserved to look like a war zone. Well, that was it. Enko put down her optics. Sasuke got sealed again with that awful mark. Better move on to studying that thing. Not just yet. Naruto held out a hand to give her pause. Instantly her interest perked, and she licked her lips, noting that he still had the set of binoculars he'd been using up on his face. As she raised her own once again, she inquired, "Oh? Something special planned?" "Yup," was his response. "Husband darling," Tsunade's voice became sweetly threatening. "Share!" He chuckled. A new approach. An explanation became unnecessary as they saw the results for themselves unfolding out on the field. Ouch, Shizen muttered unnecessarily. So, how's the Thousand Garas approach to fighting Orochimaru suit you? Naruto asked them all a moment later. Short, Anko snarled, lowering her glasses again, face disgusted. I've never seen the old bastard run away that fast from anything. You taught the demon container from sand how to use our shadow clone technique? Tsunade mumbled out, surprised. How? When did you find the time? He's not in these resets, is he? No, he's not. I haven't found a way to use our link to get any guys writing out the resets with us yet, Naruto frowned. I had to befriend him, then use our time dilation illusion to teach him. It turns out demon containers have a natural advantage with the technique. He can create almost as many clones as I could when I was just starting out. I still can't believe you took one of the most cherished secret techniques of the highest level Sharingan and made your own version of it, Kurenai mused under her breath. That's just so above what I'd expect, and then to revise it into a training tool. She resumed, shaking her head. Several others shared looks. Nothing shocked a true expert like learning a newbie to their trade just broke one of the rules. She'd known about that for months now and still couldn't entirely get over it. We could beat him, Hana declared firmly. Caught in between the Thousand Garas, our own couple thousand Narutos, Jiraiya and Tsunade, we could pin and beat Orochimaru. Yeah, but Konoha would be wrecked in the three-way summon battle, Anko corrected bitterly. Might be good to do it for practice a few times, however, Tsunade gloated. I need to learn more of my former teammates' newest tricks, and I won't do that well enough by standing off at a safe distance with binoculars. A few resets where I fight him, learning to predict his moves while he won't recall mine, are one good way of starting his eventual takedown. Of course, she wasn't influenced at all over how Naruto rewarded her for things like this. No, not at all. She licked her lips in anticipation of such rewards to come, however. Sakura and Naruto were both kneeling over Sasuke's feverish and shaking body in a shallow cave made by tree roots when it happened. Sakura cleared her throat painfully. Naruto? Do you think maybe after we get out of here, you could take me out? He'd been a complete gentleman with Hinata, after all. That lunch date they'd been on together had been very cute. Surely it couldn't be too bad? He'd learned by hard experience that most forms of gentle turn-downs only made her try this harder, so he repeated. Sakura, I asked you out once a day, on average, for 6 years. That's 2,190 requests for a date, and each time you turned me down was worse than the last. Sorry, but I'm not interested. Oh. Just as the pink-haired genin began having her personality crisis, Tsunade, the legendary medic, and the Kunoichi's personal heroine of the Sannin came charging out of the brush, Anko, the lead examiner for this test, and several other Kunoichi right behind her. Instant hope bloomed in the young girl's breast. Oh. You're going to help Sasuke? Oh. Thank you? Sorry, kid, Tsunade told her shortly, cutting the pinkette off before she could really start gushing. That seal is deadly. We're only here to study it so we can develop a cure for others later. The Uchiha isn't going to survive this, but we can do research to save others later. As Shizen started to slip into her supporting role, helping out her legendary teacher, she still provided brightly. Well, at least Naruto was able to tell us several of the more important details, like that the ink is all poison-based. Orochimaru was a snake freak, and snakes inject their poison by biting, so he'd willingly chosen to bite people to provide those curse marks. Yeah, but the seals have already compressed. Anko rubbed her own throat where her mark lay idle. It's going to be a bugger to decode them all, even with all of the information he already gave us. Sakura just shrank into the background, feeling miserable and sorry for herself. Sorry, kid, Tsunade told her shortly, cutting the pinkette off before she could really start gushing. That seal is deadly. We don't know half of what we need to cure it successfully yet. That might just be possible, kid. But don't get your hopes up, Tsunade told her shortly, cutting the pinkette off before she could really start gushing. This is one of the most complex, chakra-invasive techniques yet devised by a very cunning mind, and a legendary genius. It's taken more work than you know to be able to do this. And you'd be surprised at how much of the foundation work was done by Naruto, your teammate, Shizen added on her own. Well, that's it. A successful test, Tsunade gave off a sigh of relief as she rose up, stretching the kinks out of her back and arms. Below her, the mark had faded off of Sasuke's shoulder, and his fever and trembling had subsided. He's going to live. We should be able to remove the marks now at any stage of completion. The amazing thing was Naruto almost had it right all along, Shizen agreed. He was right in that the key was in dissolving those poison-based inks. He just didn't have the experience to be able to do that despite all of the many self-perpetuating hooks they had into the body's chakra system. Enko had already stripped to the waist and turned around, facing her own cursed mark to the slug Sannin for removal. She tried hard to conceal how desperate she was to have it gone, and didn't succeed very well. Seeing Naruto looking on like nothing was happening as the bare-chested woman was getting treatment, Sakura darted forward and covered his eyes with her hands. Naruto! You shouldn't look when a lady isn't decent! The Pinkette then stared in disbelief as the crowd of Jonin and other very senior-ranking kunoichi all broke out laughing, as if she told a joke. And Naruto! How dare he laugh at her so? I'm going to have to learn to do that myself one of these days, Enko told her husband with gratitude as he removed her curse seal just after waking her up, following yet another reset. The boy answered her with a glad shrug. Since one of the foundations of Clan Kitsune is cross-training, I figured you'd want to eventually. I know all of the younger girls are learning it, Enko returned, putting back on her top or actually, the new one he'd brought, rather than the see-through mesh one she'd used to tease Konoha for years with something almost but not quite indecent. Kid was a fantastic tailor, and she had no reason to tease anymore. She'd bagged the guy those in the know agreed was the best male ever to grace Konoha with his presence, and they meant that quite literally. Hardly surprising, Naruto conceded. Most of them grew up idolizing her. I'd take any change I had to learn whatever the fourth Hokage wanted to teach me if he suddenly showed up in my life. He meant that as rhetorical, but Enko caught his arm and spent a moment seriously considering it. She looked him dead in the eye and asked, why wouldn't he? Naruto laughed, scratching the back of his head with his free arm. Because he's dead? Yeah, she returned, nodding sagely. And so are the first and second ones, too. But that doesn't stop Rochi-chan from bringing them back to fight the third. That stopped the blonde boy, and he had to consider that some more, but his most intense wife was already pressing home on her newfound point. Okay, that technique he uses puts them under his absolute control, but since when have you ever copied a technique and stuck within the absolute limitations? Naruto's jaw dropped open. Then slowly, as it closed, his eyes began to gleam. Enko began nuzzling his cheek, asking, do I get a reward for being a good girl, now? His responding grin was infectious. Hinata sat up from the place when she'd been laying, covered in a vast network of seals boosting the medical jutsu just used on her, a glad smile spreading wide over her face as she looked first at Naruto, then the slug Sannin, who returned her a very tired smile. The lavender-haired girl's fox-like ears twitched in response to a noise too faint for most to hear, then the furry tail unfurled from out behind her, and the former Hyuga heiress' dainty whiskers twitched. Cute! A half-dozen of her fellow wives descended on her in a rush to hug the stuffings out of the newly accessorized damsel. Kurenai had taken to covering for the girls, revealing each reset to the other jonin that she'd created a study group for them to improve their social and ninja skills. Of course, what they really did was have pajama parties at her house, with furry bits hanging out in brown, lavender, and blonde hair while Naruto did a complete set of new measurements over everyone so they could have new outfits suited to their temporary foxy bits. Yes, temporary. The medical design seal arrays and the bloodline transfer techniques were exhausting even for Tsunade. So until Naruto could do them all by himself, they couldn't afford to do this for all of them every reset, and the jutsu applied foxy bits, like all physical changes, vanished in between unlike his own self-perpetuating chakra-inspired ones. Still, they were all so excited to have them, they did this fairly often. And Naruto was learning very quickly under Tsunade's inspired tutelage, how to be a much better medic than he'd been with an emphasis on bloodline transfer techniques for now, because very soon they'd be wanted to share out those wonderful Hyuga eyes as well as his foxy bits, and Tsunade herself just couldn't take the strain of so many massive, chakra-intensive rituals so close together. So it was have Naruto do it, or no one. Still, the girls were all picking it up just as fast. Naruto had loved Tsunade out of her hemophobia, curing the root of that ill, where she'd lost the last man she'd ever loved to gory injuries, by granting her enough love so that the trauma of that far distant memory was no longer attached to so great a loss. Or, to explain further, she'd linked the sight of blood to one of the greatest and most devastating losses in her life, and she'd been unable to move on for years, or even fully practice her medical abilities. Time heals all wounds. Nobody, no matter how dedicated, can feel just as bad about a traumatic experience 30 years later as they did on the day of. It can still cripple them, but it no longer has the power it once did unless they choose to let it do so. But you can't stay hung up on how miserable and unhappy you are if you are too busy having a wonderful time. Naruto was an explosion of energy. He was unstoppable, and between the massive sensory overload of his S-rank massages, according to Anko, the food, the clothes, and all of the exciting things to do developing the new clan and sharing in the discoveries they've made, Tsunade wasn't so empty inside that the ghosts of her past had power over her, as they once did. Those long-gone shades and empty memories of a pain from long ago simply couldn't stand the light of entering Naruto's life. And he loved her. Love was important to women in a big way. She could still futilely try drawing on that empty reservoir of the long-dead memory of a man who'd once loved her, or she could accept the flow from the one who did now. It was so easy she didn't even have to consciously make the choice. The bad memories that had once been haunting her packed up and moved out, as there simply wasn't room for them in her life anymore. So, no longer held back by that ball and chain of past trauma, she started to be that legendary Sannin and medic she'd once been, rather than the drunken gambler she'd become in the interval, and all of them were better for the change, as with that switch she became a more excellent teacher, and all of those girls began to pick up her skills. Especially Shizen. Kurenai mentioned that she found it very interesting that the new Kitsune clan appeared to be positioned to become the prominent illusion and medical experts of Konoha, along with a lot of minor talents and skills, especially when that was the furthest thing from Naruto's original purpose of being cool fighters. "What are you doing?" Shizen stopped what she'd been doing. Learning how to deliver a calf? Hana wants us all to pick up studying veterinary science as soon as possible. She says that it's just as important to keep our clan protectors alive as it is to know medicine for ourselves. And how do I resemble a cow? Size mostly. The girl trembled. Actually, I more closely resemble a barn you might keep a cow in than a cow. And speaking about things inside, can you do something about your arm? Suddenly realizing what she'd been caught doing, Shizen pulled her well-greased arm out with a wet slurk and began stammering apologies. "Oh, I am so very sorry. You see, the book says that in order to deliver a breech birth on a large animal you've got to slide your arm into the birth canal, and—" The QB sighed, cutting her off. "Oh, forget it. Let's put it down to this. You're a vet, and I'm an animal, and chalk it up to one of those unpleasant medical experiences no one likes to talk about. At least you were the only one to see my humiliation." "Well, from what they've been telling me, they've all done this before using you as a model. I was just catching up," Shizen admitted shyly, with a blush, before realizing that might not be the most comforting thing to say. "Oh, they have they?" The QB asked with narrowed eyes, then sighed. "You've got the scent of my master all over you, so I cannot kill you, in spite of how much I'd like to. Tell me, what else has he been up to?" "Oh, a few things." Shizen stepped away from the cage, hurriedly wiping the grease off of her arm. "I'll go and get him so you can discuss it." And with that, she darted away from the QB enclosure, a very nice gilded cage set out on the garden lawn of the mansion in his mind. Thanks for watching, Shinobi Squad. If you enjoyed this What If, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next twist. Drop your theories in the comments, I'm always reading. Want more Naruto heat? Check out the other videos on the channel. Stay sharp, stay awesome, and remember, even shadow clones need love. Peace out, Shinobi!